a few minutes before noon on the 24th of September 1869, in a small, packed trading room just off Wall Street, the price of gold stopped making sense. The room was called the Gold Room, and it existed to trade exactly one thing. On its wall, a mechanical indicator displayed the current price of $100 in gold, measured in paper dollars. For days that number had been climbing, 140, 145, 150, hauled upward by a buying force nobody could identify and nobody could stop. Brokers who had sold gold they did not own watched their ruin printed on the dial in real time. Men wept openly. The crowd spilled into the street, where thousands stood staring at the telegraph offices. What almost nobody in that room knew was that the buying force had a name, two names, and a plan of genuinely astonishing scope. Two men were attempting to buy all the gold in America, not a large position, not a dominant share. All of it, every ounce available for trade in the New York market, so that everyone who owed gold would have to buy it back from them, at whatever price they chose to name. And because there was exactly one institution on earth holding enough gold to break such a corner, the Treasury of the United States, their plan required something more audacious than money. It required capturing the financial policy of the American government itself, reaching into the White House, through the president's own family, and persuading Ulysses S. Grant to keep the Treasury's vaults shut while they squeezed a nation. For 3 weeks it worked. The price of American money was, in a meaningful sense, being set by two private citizens in New York, and the only body capable of overruling them had been talked, dined, and married into standing still. This is the story of the gold ring of 1869 of Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, the strangest partnership in the history of American money, of the brother-in-law, the bribed official, and the letter that unraveled everything, of the original American Black Friday, when the government finally opened the vault and the price collapsed in minutes, and of the most instructive part, which is what happened afterwards. To the men who did it, almost nothing at all. Along the way, we will answer the question this channel exists for. How does a corner actually work? And why did the men who ran this one understand, before anyone else, that the real game was never on the trading floor? It was in Washington. Start with why gold was traded at all. Because the gold room is extinct, and its logic needs rebuilding. Before the Civil War, American paper money was convertible. A dollar bill was a claim on gold, redeemable at the counter. The war broke that. To pay for it, the Union printed money pure and simple, the famous greenbacks, and suspended conversion. From 1862, America ran on two kinds of money at once. Gold, the real international money required for customs duties and foreign trade, and greenbacks, the domestic paper, worth whatever people believed the government's promises were worth. The two traded against each other, and the gap between them was the most watched number in American finance. When the Union lost battles, the greenback sank and gold soared. When it won, gold fell. After the war, the premium settled but did not vanish. In 1869, it took roughly 135 paper dollars to buy 100 gold dollars, and a whole marketplace, the gold room, existed to trade that gap. Understand who needed it. Every importer owed customs duties in gold. Every exporter, above all the merchants moving the great autumn grain harvest to Europe, was paid in gold-linked bills. Merchants bought and sold gold constantly to hedge, and speculators traded alongside them. It was, in effect, a market in the credibility of the United States, and it was small. The floating supply of actual gold available in New York was, by the best estimates, somewhere between $15 and $25 million worth. Hold that number, and now let us define the crime, because a corner is a precise machine, and this channel owes you the mechanism twice. To corner a market is to buy not just the available supply of a thing, but more than exists. You buy the physical supply. Then you keep buying promises, contracts from traders who sell you gold for future delivery, believing they can buy it back cheaper before the settlement date. These short sellers are, collectively, promising to deliver something that you already own all of. When settlement comes, they must buy from the only seller in the world, you. The price at that moment is not a market price. It is a ransom. Say it a second way, because everything turns on it. A short seller's loss is unlimited. He must deliver at any cost, and in a cornered market, the cost is chosen by his enemy. The corner does not profit from gold going up in the ordinary way. It profits from a manufactured moment in which a definite group of trapped men must pay any number you write on the board. It is less like investing than like buying every exit from a building and then charging for the doors. Corners on ordinary stocks happened regularly in that era. But gold was different in one terrifying, magnificent way. The floating supply was tiny, those 15-odd millions, while the United States Treasury sat on roughly 100 million in gold and sold a few million every month as routine policy. Any corner in gold could be shattered in an afternoon by a single government order to sell. The Treasury was not a participant in the market. It was the weather. Which means the gold ring's founding insight was this: a gold corner is not a financial operation. It is a political one. Buy the gold, yes, but first, arrange for the weather. Now the two men, because their partnership is one of the great odd couples of financial history. Jay Gould was in his early 30s, slight, dark, silent, tubercular, a man who spoke little, wrote less, and was already regarded by Wall Street with a fear that bordered on superstition. He had clawed his way from a poor upstate farm through the leather trade into railroads, and in the notorious Erie War had fought Cornelius Vanderbilt to a standstill, with tactics involving a printing press producing fresh Erie stock certificates approximately as needed, and judges purchased approximately as often. He controlled the Erie Railway. He thought in systems, silently, several moves ahead. James Fisk Jr. was his opposite in every visible particular. Fat, loud, jeweled, irrepressible, a former circus hand and traveling peddler who had bought himself the title of admiral by acquiring a steamboat line and a colonel's uniform to go with it, ran an opera house as his corporate headquarters, and lived in a blaze of showgirls, brass bands, and newspaper copy. New York adored him the way it adores its rogues. He supplied the noise, the nerve, and the public face. Gould supplied the design. Behind them stood the Erie machine, a railroad treasury they used as a war chest, and the friendship of Tammany Hall, whose judges could produce an injunction as fast as other men produced a handshake. Fresh from the Erie War, they were the two most notorious operators in America, and in the summer of 1869, Gould's silent attention settled on the gold premium. He had, it must be said, a cover story, and it was a good one, which is the first lesson of this episode taking shape. Gould argued, in public and in earnest, that a higher gold price was good for America. The reasoning: when gold is dear, the paper dollar is cheap. When the dollar is cheap, American wheat is cheap for European buyers. Cheap wheat means the great harvest moves, means freight for railroads, his railroad, hauling grain east, means prosperity for the Western farmer. Therefore, the government should let gold rise, and above all should not sell from the treasury and force it down. Notice what that argument is. It is not a lie exactly. The mechanism is real, and respectable men believed versions of it. It is a policy argument that happens to demand precisely the government inaction that a corner requires. Every scheme this channel has ever covered carries one of these: a public interest case that aligns, coincidentally, with the private position. The crop theory was the gold rings, and it was good enough to say to a president with a straight face. Which brings us to the family, and to the reason this episode belongs on a channel about money rather than one about politics. Every operator in New York understood that the Treasury controlled the gold price. What separated Good from all of them was that he treated that fact as an engineering problem with a solution, rather than as a wall. The others accepted the weather. He went looking for the man who said it. And here the structure of the American government in 1869 was almost an invitation. The decision to sell gold was not made by a committee, a board, or an independent institution with published minutes. It was made in practice by the Secretary of the Treasury in consultation with the President. Two men, informally, with no procedural insulation whatever between them and whoever happened to have their ear. There was no Federal Reserve to stand between politics and the money supply. That was still 44 years away. The most consequential financial lever in America was, in the most literal sense, attached to a dinner conversation. Good's insight was to find the shortest path to that conversation. Not a bribe, bribes are evidence, but a relationship, a family tie, and a share of the profits that made the intermediary a believer rather than an accomplice. Abel Rathbone Corbin was a 61-year-old speculator and fixer of long, quiet experience who had recently made the acquisition of his life. He had married Virginia Grant, the sister of the President of the United States. Good cultivated Corbin the way he did everything, patiently, generously, and with a ledger in mind. Corbin received, on extraordinarily comfortable terms, a position in gold worth some $1.5 million, carried by Good, on which the paper profits accumulated as the price rose. Nothing so crude as a bribe, merely an investment that made Corbin's enthusiasm for the crop theory deeply sincere. And Corbin delivered access. Through the summer of 1869, as Grant passed through New York, the new president found himself repeatedly in the company of Mr. Good and the remarkable Mr. Fisk, a box at Fisk's Opera House, a passage on Fisk's Fall River steamboat, dinners at Corbin's brownstone, and at each encounter, gently, the conversation turned to the currency, the harvest, and the wisdom of leaving gold alone. Grant deserves a moment of honest framing, because his role is the contested heart of this story. He was the most admired man in America, and among the least experienced in finance ever to hold the office. A soldier of transparent personal integrity whose besetting weakness, displayed again and again across his presidency, was loyalty to and naivety about the rich men who courted him. The historian's verdict then and since is broadly consistent, not corrupt but penetrable. The gold ring did not buy the president. They surrounded him with family, with hospitality, with a plausible theory, and for a crucial few weeks, it amounted to the same thing. The ring also attended to the machinery below the president. The assistant treasurer at New York, the official who physically executed Treasury gold sales, was due for replacement, and through Corbin's good offices the post went to General Daniel Butterfield, a war hero best remembered today for composing the bugle call taps. Butterfield received from Good a loan. He later insisted it was merely a loan of $10,000, roughly twice his annual salary, and thereafter kept the ring informed of the Treasury's intentions. An attempt to reach Grant's private secretary, Horace Porter, failed. Porter indignantly refused the position opened in his name. An account may also have been opened in the name of the First Lady, Julia Grant. The later congressional investigation heard testimony about it. The principals denied it, and the truth of that particular thread has never been established. We flag it and move on, because the proven machinery is damning enough. It is worth pausing on how the buying was actually conducted, because the operational craft is as impressive as the politics and is usually skipped. A corner has a structural problem. The moment the market realizes one buyer is accumulating, the price runs away before the position is complete, and every short becomes cautious. So the accumulation must be invisible. Good's solution was to spread his buying across a fan of brokerage houses. Smith, Good, Martin and Company was his own, but the orders also went through Heath and Company, through Belden and Company, through half a dozen others, with the brokers instructed not to reveal for whom they acted, and in several cases, unaware that the other houses were buying for the same principle. To the floor it looked like broad, healthy demand from many quarters. It was one man, wearing 8 hats. There was a second layer of concealment, and it was cleverer. Good also encouraged the shorts. If the market believed the Treasury was certain to sell and crush the price, more traders would sell gold forward, and every one of them was another future forced buyer. So while the ring bought quietly, the story circulating on the street was that gold was absurdly overpriced and due for a fall. The corner needed its victims to feel intelligent right up to the moment they were destroyed. That is not incidental to the design, it is the design. A corner without confident shorts is just an expensive pile of gold. And there was a third element, which is why the scheme could reach the size it did. Most of the buying was done on margin and credit, with the Erie Railway's treasury and a network of friendly banks, several of which Good and Fisk influenced or controlled, standing behind it. The ring's nominal position by late September was reported in the tens of millions, against a floating supply of perhaps 20. They had, in effect, promised to buy several times all the gold in New York, using money that was itself substantially borrowed. Leverage upon a captured referee. Remove any one of the three and the plan collapses, and in the end, the referee was the one that moved. By late August, the stage was set. Good began to buy, quietly, through a syndicate of brokers who did not know of each other, so that no single hand was visible. Gold stood near 132. Through early September, it crept upward as the ring absorbed the floating supply and began accumulating the promises of the shorts, who, seeing gold at absurd heights with the whole of Wall Street convinced the Treasury must soon sell, shorted it ever more heavily. Which was, of course, the trap. Every short was another prisoner who would someday need to buy. Then, in the middle of September, the plan began to wobble at its political end, and produced the letter on which the whole story turns. Grant, no fool for long, had grown uneasy. The pressure to keep the Treasury out of the market had become too insistent, from too predictable a direction. He remarked to his Treasury Secretary, George Boutwell, that something in the gold agitation smelled wrong, and his manner toward his brother-in-law's financial opinions cooled sharply. And in mid-September, from a Pennsylvania resort, Julia Grant wrote a letter to her sister-in-law, Corbin's wife, containing a sentence to this effect: "The president is very much distressed by your husband's speculations. Tell him to disengage at once." Corbin, receiving it, panicked, and made the fatal error of showing the letter to Good, begging to be bought out of his position with his profits intact. Put yourself behind Jay Good's quiet eyes at that moment. The letter told him everything. The White House was lost, the Treasury would sell, the corner was doomed. Every rule of partnership demanded he warn his Confederates and retreat together. What he actually did has secured his place in the Black Museum of American Finance ever since. He told no one. He carried Corbin along with soothing words and a partial settlement to keep him silent. And while Fisk, kept entirely in the dark, bulled the market upward with theatrical public buying, roaring confidence at the gold room through his brokers, Good began, through other brokers, to sell. Quietly, steadily, into the very panic of short covering his own operation had created, and into the buying of his own partner. There is treachery, and then there is selling your corner to your co-conspirator. The gold ring's final days were a conspiracy of one man against everyone, including the other conspirator. Before the last day, 3 things about the world of 1869 need setting down, because they explain why a scheme this outrageous was even conceivable, and why it very nearly worked. The first is the gold room itself, which deserves a proper description because no institution like it exists now. It sat at the corner of William Street and Exchange Place in a building the traders called, without affection, the Coal Hole. Inside was a small amphitheater of tiered seats around a central fountain, a Cupid statue spouting water, of all things, into a basin, with the great price indicator mounted high on the wall, its numbers driven by a clerk in a booth. The noise was famously appalling. 150 men shouting bids at once in a room built for far fewer, the sound audible in the street. 2 features of that room matter for our story. First, its trades were cleared through a private clearinghouse that netted members' positions daily and required margin to be posted, which meant that, when the price moved violently, the calls for margin came within hours, not weeks, and men who could not find cash by afternoon were finished by evening. Second, the indicator on the wall was wired to telegraph offices across America, so the number in that little room was, functionally, the price of American money everywhere. A grain merchant in Chicago, a cotton factor in New Orleans, an importer in Boston, all of them priced their world off the dial in the Coal Hole. Corner that room, and you did not corner a market. You seized the country's unit of account. The second thing is the state of American finance in the 4th year after the Civil War, because the gold ring did not grow in normal soil. The war had ended with the government owing an unprecedented national debt, the currency untethered, and an entire generation of operators trained in wartime speculation, in which fortunes had been made on the telegraphed news of battles. Regulation, in any modern sense, did not exist. There was no Securities and Exchange Commission that lay 65 years in the future, after the crash our 1929 episode covers. There was no Federal Reserve. That was 44 years off, and it took the panic our 1907 episode describes to produce it. Corporate law was primitive. Insider trading was not a concept anyone had criminalized, and manipulation was regarded less as a crime than as a sport at which some men were better than others. Into that vacuum stepped the era's characteristic figure, the operator who understood that the rules were not merely weak but genuinely absent, and that the men enforcing them could be hired. Good and Fisk were not aberrations of the Gilded Age. They were its purest expression, arriving early. The third thing is the Erie War, because it is the rehearsal without which the gold ring makes no sense. In 1868, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the richest man in America and the most feared, set out to buy control of the Erie Railway, of which Good and Fisk were directors. Their response has entered legend. As fast as Vanderbilt bought Erie shares, they printed new ones. Convertible bonds were issued and converted. Tens of thousands of fresh certificates poured from the company's own press into Vanderbilt's buying, and the great man found himself trying to corner a stock whose supply his opponents controlled with a lever. When New York judges friendly to Vanderbilt issued injunctions, Good and Fisk fled across the Hudson to Jersey City with several $1 million in a carriage, fortified a hotel with cannon and armed men against the possibility of abduction, and directed operations from what the newspapers gleefully called Fort Taylor. Good then traveled to Albany with a satchel of money and secured legislation retroactively legalizing what they had done. That episode taught them 3 lessons they carried directly into 1869. That a corner can be defeated by anyone who controls supply, hence the necessity of controlling the treasury. That courts are an instrument, not a constraint, if you own the judges. and that a legislature can be purchased outright, which raised the natural question: why stop at a legislature? They had cornered the Erie. Now they proposed to corner the dollar. And note the escalation in their thinking. In 1868, they had bought a legislature to legalize what they had already done: reactive, defensive, cleaning up afterwards. In 1869, they set out to secure the government's decision in advance, before the position was even built. That is a different order of ambition, not corrupting the referee after the foul, but recruiting him before the match. So we arrive at Friday, the 24th of September, 1869, the day the name Black Friday entered the American vocabulary. Viewers of our British series will note the collision. London's Black Friday, the overrun Gurney Panic, had come just 3 years earlier. 2 countries, 3 years, one name, each marking the day a market discovered what stood behind it. The morning opened at 143 and went vertical. Fisk's brokers bid gold up through 150, 155, 160. His chief broker, a man named Albert Spayers, standing in the boiling crowd executing orders to buy millions upon millions at any price, orders Fisk would later blandly deny having given. The premium at 160 meant ruin for hundreds of trapped shorts. The crowd in and around the gold room grew so frantic that observers genuinely feared for lives. Business in grain and imports froze nationwide because nobody could price anything. Telegraph wires carried the delirium to every exchange in the country. In Washington, Grant and Boutwell conferred through the morning as the wires reported each new impossible print. Shortly before noon, the order went out, the one the whole scheme had existed to prevent. The Treasury of the United States would sell $4 million of gold at once. The news reached the gold room in minutes. The price did not decline, it ceased. Gold fell from the 160s to the 130s almost between ticks, a fall of nearly 30 points in roughly the time it takes to read this sentence. Men who had been ruined as shorts at 11 o'clock watched their tormentors ruined as longs at noon. Spayers, who had bought tens of millions at the top on Fisk's word, was left holding contracts worth catastrophically less than he had paid, and was widely reported to have been driven half out of his mind on the floor. The gold room that afternoon was described by witnesses in the language of a battlefield after the guns stopped. One consequence deserves its own moment, because it is the detail that turns a Wall Street story into a national one. The Gold Exchange's clearing house, the machinery that netted every member's trades and settled them, simply could not process what had happened. Contracts had been struck at 160 and at 133 within the same hour. Nobody could establish who owed what to whom, and thousands of trades were left in a state of formal limbo. The clearing house suspended operations. For days afterwards, the settlement of the New York gold market, and with it a large part of American foreign trade financing, was frozen, not because the price was wrong, but because the record of who had promised what had ceased to be legible. That is a failure mode this channel has met before, in a different century. When a market moves far enough fast enough, the problem stops being valuation and becomes plumbing. The 2008 crisis had exactly this quality once the derivatives could not be netted. In 1869, the plumbing was clerks with ledgers, and it burst. The wreckage spread far beyond the room. Brokerage houses failed by the dozen. The stock market, infected by the panic, fell sharply in the following days, ruining operators who had never touched gold. The grain trade, the very farmers of the crop theory, was paralyzed for weeks by the pricing chaos, and the export season was damaged, not helped. As always in these stories, the circle of the burned extended far past the circle of the guilty. Clerks, country banks, commission men, the small shorts and small longs alike, none of whom had ever heard of Abel Corbin. And the guilty. Here is the part of the story that made it a founding legend of the Gilded Age. Good, who had sold through the collapse he foresaw, came out approximately unhurt by some accounts, richly ahead. The exact figure is unknowable and was much mythologized. Fisk, betrayed and buried under ruinous contracts, executed the simplest maneuver of all. He repudiated. The purchases, he declared, had been made by brokers exceeding their authority. Let the brokers bear them. Asked where the money had gone, he supplied the era with one of its immortal phrases. It had gone, he said, where the woodbine twineth. Erie's tame judges produced injunctions that froze every suit and settlement into a procedural swamp, from which nothing hostile ever emerged. The two men retired behind their lawyers, their Tammany friends and the walls of the Opera House, and paid, in any legal sense, nothing. Congress did what legislatures do when a scandal is too large to ignore and too well-connected to punish. It investigated. A committee under James Garfield, a future president examining the wreckage around a sitting one, took testimony through 1870 and produced a report that laid out the mechanism, the Corbin arrangement and the Butterfield loan in humiliating detail. Butterfield resigned. Corbin was destroyed as a public man and lived out his years in obscurity. The report pointedly cleared the president of corrupt participation while making his credulity uncomfortably plain, and Democrats mocked the majority for declining to summon Julia Grant or press the family thread. No one was prosecuted. There was, in truth, very little to prosecute with. Manipulating the gold market was not, in 1869, a defined crime. The acts were outrageous, the statutes were silent. If you have watched our Overend Gurney or Railway Mania episodes, you know this rhythm. The law arrives one disaster late every time. The afterlives complete the picture. Fisk never saw the reckoning of age. In 1872, he was shot dead on the staircase of a Manhattan hotel by a rival for the affections of his mistress. A finale so operatic that enormous crowds turned out for the funeral of a man who had helped engineer Black Friday 3 years before. Good went serenely on to greater things: Union Pacific, Western Union, an empire of rails and wires, and died in his bed in 1892, worth some $70 million, perhaps the most hated and least punished man in 19th century American finance. Grant was re-elected in a landslide. The lesson absorbed by every sharp operator in America was precise. The game was survivable, the profits keepable, and the referee reachable. The Gilded Age had received its founding demonstration. Before the lessons, two threads deserve closing, because the aftermath of 1869 shaped America more than the panic itself did. The first is what the gold ring did to Ulysses Grant, and threw him to the presidency. Grant survived Black Friday politically. The Garfield report cleared him. The country still loved the general, and he won a second term comfortably. But something in the episode set the template for everything that followed. His administration became the most scandal-ridden of the century. The Credit-Moblier affair, in which Union Pacific insiders distributed shares to congressmen. The Whiskey Ring, in which distillers and revenue officials stole millions in tax. The Belknap affair, in which his own Secretary of War was found selling trading posts. In none of these was Grant personally enriched. In all of them, the pattern of 1869 repeated exactly. Honest man, dishonest intimates, a willingness to believe that people who were charming to him were also honest, and a fatal slowness to ask what a friend was actually selling. He learned the lesson too late and paid for it twice. After leaving office, he invested his entire fortune in a Wall Street partnership run by a young financier named Ferdinand Ward, the Madoff of his generation. running a straightforward Ponzi scheme our earlier episode would recognize instantly. Ward's firm collapsed in 1884 and took every dollar Grant had. Bankrupt and dying of throat cancer, the old general spent his last year racing to finish his memoirs so his wife would have an income, and completed them days before his death. They are, by common agreement, the finest memoir any American president ever wrote, produced under a deadline set by mortality, and a debt created by exactly the kind of man who had first come at him through his brother-in-law in 1869. There is something almost unbearable in that arc. The gold ring was the first demonstration that Grant could not tell a financial predator from a friend. 15 years later, the same blindness cost him everything he had, and the country got a masterpiece out of his ruin. The second thread is the machinery that eventually grew where none existed. It is worth tracing, because the whole moral of this channel is that financial law is scar tissue. In 1869, there was nothing. No market regulator, no central bank, no criminal law of manipulation, no obligation on the Treasury to explain its operations. Every one of those absences was exploited by the ring, and everyone was eventually filled, but slowly, and only after further disasters. The New York Gold Exchange itself withered when America returned to the gold standard in 1879, and the premium vanished. The room that had priced the country's money simply lost its reason to exist. The Federal Reserve arrived in 1913, after the Panic of 1907 demonstrated that a nation of that size could not keep relying on one private banker's balance sheet, a story we have told in full. Federal securities law, with its explicit prohibition of manipulative practices, arrived in 1933 and 1934, after the crash. Commodity market manipulation, the direct descendant of cornering, was not comprehensively addressed until the Commodity Exchange Act of 1936 and its successors. That is 67 years between the gold ring and a statute that squarely prohibited what it did. 6 decades in which the technique remained, in the main, legal. And when a comprehensive corner was finally attempted again on a comparable scale, the Hunt brothers' extraordinary bid to corner the world silver market in 1979 and 1980, the outcome told you exactly what had changed and what had not. The Hunts, like the ring, accumulated a colossal position. Like the ring, they were beaten not by other traders but by the rule setters, when the exchanges changed the margin rules against them, and the price collapsed on their own Silver Thursday. The referee, not the market, again decided it. The difference was that in 1980 the referee was independent, and there was no brother-in-law to reach. Now the lessons. So what should we take from the gold ring? 4 things. First, the corner's true lesson, which is about power, not markets. Good understood that no private fortune can outbuy a sovereign. The Treasury's vault made every purely financial gold corner impossible. So he did not play against the government's balance sheet. He played for the government's decision. The modern name for this is regulatory capture, and it remains the most profitable trade in existence because it converts the referee into an asset. Watch in any era for the fortune that is spent not on the market but on the weather, on access, family, plausible theories whispered to power. That is where the gold ring lives today, and it does not meet in a gold room. Second, every scheme carries a policy argument, and the crop theory is the eternal template, a genuine mechanism, sincerely arguable, which happens to require exactly the public decision the private position needs. The test is never whether the argument is clever. It is who, precisely, is positioned to profit if the argument wins. The answer in September 1869 was a list of brokerage accounts, and the arguer owned them. Third, there is no honor among manipulators, And the corner's finest irony is that its only truly protected participant was the man who betrayed it. A conspiracy is a market too, and inside it, information advantage rules exactly as it does outside. Fisk knew the plan. Good knew the plan was dead. Whoever knows the scheme is failing first wins, including against his friends. Anyone tempted to join a sure thing should price, honestly, the likelihood that they are not the insider. They are the exit liquidity of the insider. And fourth, the accountability gap. Between what the gold ring did and what any law of 1869 forbade lay open water, and through it the whole operation sailed home. We have met this gap in every century this channel covers. The overend directors acquitted, Hudson never charged, the pattern repeating until each era, scalded, legislates its specific scald. The machinery that would eventually police such things as securities law, market manipulation statutes, a central bank, was built piece by piece on the sites of these fires. In 1869, none of it existed, and the fire simply burned until it ran out of other people's money. The gold room itself is long gone. Gold resumed its place behind the dollar in 1879, and the premium that made the whole game possible vanished with it. Though viewers of our 1933 episode know that the American relationship with gold had stranger chapters still ahead. What remains is the template, the tiny market, the trapped shorts, the family door into power, the plausible theory, the betrayal, the vault thrown open, and the two men walking away whole. It has been reprinted, with local variations, in every generation since. They tried to buy all the money, and came within one worried sister's letter of succeeding. The most dangerous sentence in finance is not that the price is rising, it is that the government is with us. Sometimes it even is. The gold ring is the permanent record of what that costs everyone else. Sources and method. This account draws on the report and testimony of the Garfield Committee's congressional investigation of 1870 into the gold panic, contemporary reporting in the New York papers of September and October 1869, the recorded prices and mechanics of the New York Gold Exchange, the memoir and biographical literature on Good, Fisk, Grant, and Boutwell, and the standard scholarly histories of the episode and of Erie-era finance. Where the record is genuinely contested, above all how far Grant's household was financially entangled, the alleged account in the First Lady's name being asserted in testimony and denied by the principals, and the exact profit or loss with which Good emerged. This video reports the competing claims as claims. Figures for the floating gold supply, the Treasury's holdings, the price path and the scale of the wreckage are given as contemporaries and later historians record them, rounded rather than falsely precise. On the 10th of July, 1832, the President of the United States sent a letter to Congress explaining why he would not sign a bill. The bill would have renewed the charter of the Second Bank of the United States. The letter was a veto message, and it ran to several thousand words. It is one of the most consequential documents in American financial history, and almost nobody has read it. What it did was destroy the only institution in the country capable of regulating the supply of money. The consequences were not abstract. Within 5 years, the United States entered a financial collapse that closed hundreds of banks, wiped out the savings of ordinary families, and began a depression that lasted the better part of 6 years. After that came a period of nearly 80 years in which the country had no central bank at all, and endured a banking panic roughly every 15 years as a result. The man who wrote the letter was Andrew Jackson. He believed he was protecting ordinary Americans from a concentration of financial power that had corrupted their government. The striking thing, and the reason this story is worth 40 minutes rather than a paragraph, is that he was substantially right about the problem and catastrophically wrong about the solution. This is the story of how the United States talked itself out of having a central bank, what it cost, and why the argument that produced it has never actually been settled. And there is a detail that makes the decision harder to defend than it first appears, which is that the United States had already run this experiment once and had already seen how it ended. The second bank of the United States was called the second because there had been a first. Alexander Hamilton, as the first Secretary of the Treasury, had pushed a national bank through Congress in 1791 over the objections of Jefferson and Madison, who argued that the Constitution gave no such power. Hamilton's answer was that a government granted the authority to tax, borrow, and regulate commerce must possess the means to do those things, and that a bank was such a means. Washington signed it. The first Bank of the United States was chartered for 20 years, and it worked. It held the government's deposits, moved money between states, lent to the Treasury, and disciplined state banknote issues in exactly the manner its successor later would. In 1811, its charter came up for renewal, and the same objections were made. Unconstitutional, too powerful, too much of its stock in foreign hands. The renewal failed in the House by 1 vote, and in the Senate on the casting vote of the vice president. The bank closed. Within 18 months, the United States was at war with Britain. What followed is the practical demonstration. Without a national bank, the government struggled to borrow, struggled to move funds to where its armies were, and struggled to pay for anything at scale. State banks multiplied and issued notes freely against reserves they did not hold. By 1814, with British troops in Washington, banks outside New England suspended payment in coin altogether, and the currency of the United States fractured into a patchwork of discounted paper. The war ended in 1815. The second bank was chartered in 1816 by a Congress that included men who had voted against renewal 5 years earlier and had changed their minds for the most persuasive reason available. They had watched what happened without one. Madison, who had argued in 1791 that a national bank was unconstitutional, signed the charter himself. So when Jackson vetoed recharter in 1832, he was not making a novel decision about an untested institution. He was making the same decision the country had made in 1811, which it had reversed within 5 years at considerable cost, having learned in the interval precisely what the absence of such a bank meant in an emergency. That is not hindsight, it was living memory. Men in that Congress had been in the previous one. Start with what the bank was, because the name is misleading in 2 directions at once. The second Bank of the United States was not a government department. It was a private corporation, chartered by Congress in 1816 for a term of 20 years, with a capital of $35 million. Of that capital, 1/5 was subscribed by the federal government, and the government appointed 5 of its 25 directors. The other 4/5 and the other 20 directors were private. So it was a hybrid, a private company holding a public franchise. Nor was it a central bank in the modern sense. It had no mandate to manage employment or inflation. It did not set an interest rate that rippled through the economy. Those ideas did not exist yet. What it did have was a specific and enormously powerful function. And to understand it, you have to understand what money was in the United States in the 1820s. There was no national paper currency. The federal government minted coins, gold and silver, but coins were scarce and heavy and impractical for large transactions. What people actually used was banknotes, pieces of paper issued by individual state-chartered banks, each promising to pay the bearer a stated sum in coin on demand. There were hundreds of such banks, and each issued its own notes. That meant the currency of the United States was not one thing. It was hundreds of things, of varying and uncertain value, and a note issued by a solid bank in Philadelphia might circulate near its face value, while a note from an obscure bank in Ohio traded at a discount of 20 or 30%, if anyone would take it at all. Merchants carried printed guides called banknote reporters, listing hundreds of issuers and the discount applicable to each. Into that system, the second bank introduced a discipline that nothing else could. Because it was the depository of federal funds, it constantly received the notes of state banks paid in as taxes, as customs duties, as land purchases. And it made a policy of presenting those notes back to the issuing banks and demanding payment in coin. That sounds procedural. It was the most powerful monetary lever in the country. A state bank that had issued far more notes than it could redeem would find itself facing a demand it could not meet. So the mere existence of the second bank, quietly collecting notes and presenting them, forced every other bank in the United States toward prudence. Issue too freely, and the bank would call you on it. That is central banking in everything but name, a constraint on the total supply of money exercised by one institution over all the others. And it worked. By the late 1820s, the American currency was more uniform and more reliable than it had ever been. Notes of the second bank itself circulated at face value across the whole country, which no other paper did. The man running it was Nicholas Biddle, president of the bank from 1823. Biddle was a Philadelphian of considerable talent and even more considerable self-regard. He had been a classical scholar, a diplomat, and an editor before he was a banker. He understood the bank's function better than almost anyone alive, and he was probably the most capable financial administrator the United States had yet produced. He was also politically careless in a way that would prove fatal. Biddle believed the bank's usefulness was self-evident. He believed that men of sense, presented with the facts, would see that a stable currency benefited everyone. He was not wrong about the economics. He was wrong about how the argument would be conducted. Because to a great many Americans, the bank did not look like a stabilizing mechanism. It looked like a small group of wealthy men in Philadelphia, holding a charter granted by Congress, with the power to decide which banks lived and which died, and answerable to almost nobody. That perception was not paranoid. It was, in its essentials, accurate. And the man who held it most fiercely was in the White House. Andrew Jackson's hostility to banks was not a policy position. It was closer to a conviction about the nature of money itself, and it had a personal origin. In the 1790s, long before the presidency, Jackson had sold land in Tennessee and accepted in payment the promissory notes of a merchant named David Allison. Allison went bankrupt. Jackson found himself liable for the debt and spent years working his way out of it. The lesson he drew was not that he had been unlucky in a counterparty. It was that paper promises were a species of lie, that real money was gold and silver, that anything else was a device by which clever men extracted value from honest ones. He carried that view into the presidency in 1829, and it shaped everything that followed. It is worth being fair to the position, because it is easy to caricature. Jackson's objection was not simply that banks were confusing, it was constitutional and political. He argued that Congress had no authority under the Constitution to charter a bank, a view with respectable support, and one Jefferson and Madison had held before him. He argued that the bank concentrated enormous economic power in private hands, insulated from democratic control, and that this was incompatible with a republic. And he argued that the bank used that power politically, that it lent to congressmen and editors on favorable terms, retained lawyers who happened to be legislators, and thereby purchased the goodwill of the men who were supposed to oversee it. That last charge was true. Biddle did lend to politicians. He did retain influential men. He regarded it as ordinary business practice and as necessary to defend the bank against attack. To Jackson, it was the corruption of the legislature by an unelected financial interest, which is one reasonable description of the same facts. So by 1832, the two men were on a collision course, and it was the bank's supporters who chose the moment. The charter did not expire until 1836. There was no need to raise the question in 1832. But Henry Clay was running for president against Jackson that year, and Clay and Daniel Webster, both of whom had close ties to the bank, believed the issue could be turned against him. Their reasoning was that recharter was popular, that Jackson would not dare veto it in an election year, and that if he did, the veto would destroy him. They persuaded Biddle to apply for renewal 4 years early. It was a catastrophic misjudgment, and it is worth naming it precisely. They turned a technical question about a banking charter into a referendum on whether the president was on the side of ordinary people or of financiers. Congress passed the recharter bill in early July 1832. Jackson vetoed it on the 10th. The veto message is the document that matters, and it is worth quoting the shape of its argument rather than its details. It begins with the constitutional case that Congress cannot charter such a body, and then does something more interesting. It turns to who benefits. Jackson pointed out that a large share of the bank's stock was held by foreigners, chiefly British, and that the profits of an American public franchise were therefore flowing overseas. He pointed out that the bank's advantages fell to those who already held capital. And then came the passage that made the message famous, and which has echoed through American politics ever since, that when the laws undertake to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. Whatever else it was, that was superb politics. Clay had expected the veto to be read as the act of a man defying Congress on behalf of an ideology. It was read instead as a president refusing to renew a privilege for the wealthy. Jackson won the 1832 election decisively. He took the result as a mandate to finish the bank rather than merely to deny it a new charter, and here the story moves from politics into money. The charter still had 4 years to run. Jackson decided not to wait. His instrument was the federal deposits. The government's money, its tax and customs receipts, sat in the bank and constituted a substantial part of its working capital. If those deposits were withdrawn and placed elsewhere, the bank would be crippled long before its charter lapsed. This proved harder than expected because the law did not clearly give him the power. The statute placed the deposits under the authority of the Secretary of the Treasury, not the President, and required the Secretary to give Congress his reasons if he moved them. Jackson's Treasury Secretary, Louis McLean, would not do it. Jackson moved him to the State Department. His replacement, William Duane, also refused and refused again when pressed. Jackson dismissed him. The third man, Roger Taney, did it. From October 1833, federal receipts went not to the Bank of the United States, but to a selection of state banks, chosen substantially for their political sympathies and known to everyone at the time as the pet banks. The pet banks deserve a moment because the phrase was contemporary and it was not affectionate. There were about 24 at first, rising to nearly 90. The formal criteria were soundness and convenience of location. The practical criterion, widely understood at the time and not much disguised, was political sympathy. A bank whose directors were friendly to the administration had a considerably better claim on federal deposits than one whose directors were not. The irony is exact and worth stating plainly. Jackson's central charge against the second bank was that it used the placement of money to buy political loyalty. His remedy was to take that money and place it, personally and through his Treasury Secretary, according to political loyalty, only now spread across dozens of institutions with no oversight body above them and no obligation to redeem each other's notes. He had not removed the problem of politically directed finance. He had decentralized it and put himself at the center. And the banks that received the deposits behaved exactly as anyone might expect. Handed a large, stable, effectively free deposit base, they lent against it. That is what banks do. There was no longer any institution presenting their notes for coin and asking whether they could cover what they had issued. Two things follow from this that are worth separating. The first is constitutional. A president had removed 2 cabinet officers in order to obtain an action Congress had assigned to their discretion. The Senate censured him for it, the only time a president has been formally censured, and the censure was later expunged when Jackson's allies regained control. The second is monetary, and it is the part that actually mattered to the country. The deposits were now spread across dozens of state banks with no coordinating institution above them, and those banks now held a great deal of federal money on which they could lend. Biddle's response turned a political defeat into an economic emergency. Holding a shrinking deposit base, he began calling in the bank's loans and contracting its credit sharply. His stated reason was prudence. An institution losing its funding must reduce its exposure. His actual reason, which he was incautious enough to put in writing, was pressure. He believed that a sufficient degree of financial distress would force Congress to restore the bank, and that nothing else would. The result, through the winter of 1833 and into 1834, was a sharp contraction. Credit dried up, businesses failed, and delegations of merchants traveled to Washington to plead for relief. Jackson's answer to them was that they should go to Biddle, since Biddle had made the distress. And on this narrow point Jackson was right, and it cost Biddle everything. By deliberately inflicting hardship to make a political argument, he demonstrated exactly the proposition Jackson had been making for years, that one private institution held the power to punish the entire country and would use it. The contraction was reversed within months. The bank's political position never recovered. It is worth following Biddle to the end, because his fall says something about how completely the institution was dismantled. When the federal charter expired in 1836, he obtained a state charter from Pennsylvania and carried on, running what had been the central bank of the United States as an ordinary commercial bank in Philadelphia. Stripped of its federal function and its federal deposits, it was now simply a large bank with a famous name, competing for business like any other. Biddle retired in 1839. The bank failed in 1841, taking with it the savings of a great many people who had trusted the name. In 1842, he was arrested and charged with criminal conspiracy in connection with the bank's affairs. The charges were eventually dismissed on a technical ground rather than a finding of innocence, and he spent his remaining years in civil litigation, his fortune largely gone. He died in 1844 at 58. There is no need to be sentimental about him. He had wielded real power carelessly and had, at the decisive moment, tried to coerce a country by squeezing its credit. But the arc is instructive. The most capable financial administrator in the United States ended as a defendant, and the institution he ran, the one that had made American money work, ended as a failed Philadelphia bank whose collapse cost ordinary depositors their money. Both facts were widely reported, and both were read at the time as vindication of everything Jackson had said. Winning the argument and being right are not the same thing, and this is the case where they came apart most completely. The charter expired in 1836. The institution continued for a few years as a Pennsylvania state bank and failed in 1841, and by then it hardly mattered. The question had been settled. What followed is the part of the story usually left out, and it is the part that establishes the cost. With the bank gone and federal money distributed to state banks, the restraint on note issue disappeared. Those banks now held large deposits and every incentive to lend against them, and there was no longer any institution routinely presenting their notes for redemption in coin. Lending expanded rapidly, and much of it went into land. The federal government was selling enormous quantities of public land in the West, and buyers were paying with banknotes, notes issued by banks that had received their reserves from federal deposits, to buy land from the federal government, which then deposited the proceeds back into the same banks, which lent them out again. That circle is worth pausing on. It is not fraud, every step is legitimate. But the same money was doing several jobs at once, and the total volume of credit was expanding with nothing anchoring it. Jackson, who understood the danger in his own terms, tried to stop it by decree. In July 1836, the Treasury issued the Specie Circular, which required that payment for public land be made in gold or silver rather than paper. The intention was to halt speculation and force the currency back toward hard money. The effect was to create a sudden, enormous demand for coin, drawn from precisely the banks that were least able to supply it. At the precise moment, their liabilities were greatest. Add two further pressures from outside. British banks, facing their own difficulties, raised interest rates and called in American credits. And the price of cotton, the principal American export and the collateral behind a great deal of lending, fell sharply. In May 1837, the banks of New York suspended payment in coin. The rest of the country followed within weeks. The Panic of 1837 was not a bad quarter. Hundreds of banks failed. Land values collapsed. Unemployment in the eastern cities reached levels without precedent in American experience, and several states defaulted on their debts, which damaged American credit in London for a generation. The depression that followed ran, with a brief remission, until about 1843. It is one of the longest contractions in American history, and it happened in a country of farmers and small merchants with no unemployment relief of any kind. It is worth being concrete about what that meant, because depression in a 19th century context is easy to read past. There was no deposit insurance. When a bank failed, the money people had placed in it was simply gone, and there was no process by which any part of it came back. There was no unemployment insurance, no public relief beyond local poor law arrangements administered by parishes and towns, with no resources for a crisis of this scale, and no bankruptcy protection worth the name for individuals until a federal act was passed in 1841 and repealed 2 years later. Wages in the eastern cities fell by something in the order of a third. In New York, there were riots over the price of flour. Construction stopped, which mattered because canal and railroad building had been employing tens of thousands of laborers, many of them recent immigrants with no land to fall back on. And the banknote problem returned immediately and viciously. With banks suspending payment in coin, their notes traded at whatever discount the market guessed at, which meant a laborer paid in the notes of a shaky bank had taken a pay cut he could not calculate and could not refuse. Then there is the part that reached beyond America's borders. A great deal of the money behind the canal and railroad boom had come from Britain. British investors, Baring brothers prominent among them, had bought the bonds of American states, which had borrowed heavily to fund internal improvements on the assumption that the projects would pay. When the revenue did not appear, the states could not service the debt. Between 1841 and 1842, 8 states and the territory of Florida defaulted. Some eventually resumed payment. Mississippi, Florida, and a few others repudiated outright, declaring the debts void and refusing to pay at all. The consequence in London was immediate and lasting. American state credit became close to unsellable, and the reputational damage attached itself to the country as a whole rather than to the particular states involved. When the federal government tried to raise a loan abroad in 1842, it could not place it. The Rothschilds are supposed to have told an American agent that the United States could not borrow a dollar, not a dollar. That is a long way downstream from a veto message in 1832, and no honest account would draw a straight line between them. But it is the world the decision helped produce, a country whose money was unreliable, whose banks could not be restrained, and whose credit abroad had been destroyed. What eventually replaced the bank as a home for federal money was not a bank at all. Under the independent treasury system, established in 1840, repealed and re-established in 1846, the government simply held its own funds in its own vaults and dealt only in coin. That solved the narrow problem of federal deposits propping up speculative lending. It solved nothing else. Government money now sat idle in strong rooms rather than circulating, which meant that when the Treasury collected taxes, it drained coin out of the banking system entirely, tightening credit at exactly the wrong moments. The system lasted, with modifications, until the Federal Reserve. So the sequence over these 20 years runs. An institution that regulated the money supply is destroyed on the argument that it is too powerful. Nothing is put in its place. The currency fragments. A mania is financed. The crash arrives. The states default. Foreign credit closes, and the eventual replacement is a strongbox. There is a political footnote here that is more than a footnote. Jackson left office in March 1837, at the end of his second term, having won every fight he picked, and with his chosen successor installed. Martin Van Buren had been his Secretary of State, his Vice President, and the principal architect of the political machine that made the Jacksonian coalition work. Van Buren was inaugurated on the 4th of March. The New York banks suspended payment on the 10th of May. So the man who took the blame for the panic of 1837 was not the man who dismantled the bank, removed the deposits, or issued the specie circular. He inherited all three 10 weeks before the collapse, and then spent a single term presiding over the worst economic conditions the Republic had known. His response was the independent treasury, and it was consistent with everything the movement believed. If banks could not be trusted with public money, the government should hold its own. It was also, in the middle of a credit contraction, precisely the wrong instrument, because it withdrew coin from a banking system that was desperate for it. He was beaten heavily in 1840 by a Whig campaign that ran almost entirely on the economy and barely bothered with policy at all. The opposition had learned Jackson's lesson about how these arguments are won. The pattern is worth noticing because it recurs constantly in financial history. The person who dismantles a safeguard is rarely the person in office when the consequence arrives. Jackson's reputation survived intact. He is on the $20 bill, which is either an irony or a joke, depending on how charitable you are feeling about paper money. Van Buren's did not survive at all. That asymmetry is part of why safeguards get dismantled. The benefit of removing a restraint is immediate and attributable. The cost arrives later and lands on somebody else. Assigning blame precisely is not possible and would be dishonest to attempt. The cotton price, British monetary policy, and a genuine speculative mania all contributed, and none of them were Jackson's doing. But the mechanism that might have restrained the credit expansion had been deliberately dismantled 4 years earlier, and the specie circular was a direct act of the administration at the worst possible moment. The bank war did not cause the panic of 1837 by itself. It removed the shock absorber and then struck the wheel. What replaced the bank was not a better system. It was no system. The decades that followed are sometimes called the free banking era, which makes it sound like a considered policy. In practice, it meant that states set their own rules for who could issue money, and those rules varied from strict to essentially absent. In the laxer states, this produced what were known as wildcat banks, institutions that issued notes freely while placing their redemption offices somewhere deliberately inaccessible, on the theory that a note nobody could present was a note that need never be paid. By the 1850s, there were thousands of distinct banknote issues circulating in the United States, and counterfeiting was so widespread that the banknote reporters listed not only discounts but known forgeries. A merchant in Chicago receiving payment had to know the issuer, the discount, and the likelihood of fraud before he could value what he had been handed. This is the actual, practical cost of having no central authority over money, and it lasted a very long time. The National Banking Acts of the 1860s, passed to finance the Civil War, imposed a uniform national currency at last and taxed state banknotes out of existence. That solved the currency problem. It did not solve the banking problem, because there was still no institution capable of lending to banks in a crisis. So panics continued. 1857, 1873, 1893, 1907. Each followed a recognizable pattern in which sound banks failed simply because they could not convert good assets into cash quickly enough, and there was nobody to lend against those assets. In 1907, the crisis was halted by J.P. Morgan personally, working from his library, coordinating rescues among men he could summon and pressure. It worked. But it made unavoidable the observation that the financial stability of the United States now depended on the judgment and lifespan of one private individual. Morgan was 70 years old. The Federal Reserve Act was signed in December 1913, 77 years after the second bank's charter expired. The country had spent 3/4 of a century relearning, at considerable expense, what the institution it destroyed had been doing. So what should be taken from this? The first thing is that Jackson's critique was not foolish, and treating it as foolish is how the episode gets misremembered. He was objecting to a genuine problem, a private institution with public powers, extremely difficult to hold accountable, whose head lent money to the legislators responsible for overseeing him. Every element of that was true, and Biddle's conduct in 1833, deliberately contracting credit to force a political outcome, proved the central charge more thoroughly than any opponent could have. The question is not whether the concentration of financial power was real. It was. The question is what to do about it, and Jackson's answer was to abolish the institution rather than to reform its governance. That distinction is the whole lesson. The choice was never between a powerful bank and no powerful bank. It was between an accountable one and 100 unaccountable ones, and abolition delivered the second. The second thing is about the shape of the argument, because it has never gone away. Every subsequent American fight over central banking has recycled the 1832 language almost intact. The concentration of power, the unelected officials, the suspicion that a monetary authority serves creditors rather than debtors. The words Jackson used about the rich and the potent are still in circulation, quoted by people who have never read the veto message and would be surprised what else is in it. That persistence is not irrational. It reflects something structurally true. A central bank does hold enormous power. It is deliberately insulated from elections, and that insulation is both the source of its usefulness and a genuine democratic problem. Nobody has ever fully resolved that tension, and the Federal Reserve's independence is argued about in the same terms today. The third is the narrowest and the most practical. Institutions that prevent disasters are almost impossible to defend politically, because their success is invisible. The second bank's achievement was a currency that mostly worked and banks that mostly stayed solvent, outcomes nobody experiences as an achievement, because they are experienced as nothing happening at all. Its costs, by contrast, were vivid and specific. A state bank refused credit, a merchant declined, a rival institution disciplined. Every one of those produced a person with a grievance and a story. So the ledger was always going to look one-sided. The benefits were diffuse and silent. The costs were concentrated and articulate. That asymmetry is not a feature of 1832. It is a permanent feature of any institution whose job is to stop things going wrong. And it is why such institutions are chronically undefended right up until the moment they are missed. Biddle understood the economics and lost anyway, because he never grasped that being correct was not the same as being persuasive, and because when he finally reached for a political weapon, he chose the one that proved his opponent's case. Jackson understood the politics completely and won, and the country then spent 77 years and 4 major panics paying for the victory. There is one last thing worth saying, and it is the reason this episode is not simply a story about a president and a banker. The second bank was never put to a vote of the people. It was created by Congress, defended by lawyers, and destroyed by a veto. But the argument that destroyed it was made directly to voters, in language they understood, about a question they recognized. Who does the money system serve? Biddle answered that question with statistics about note discounts and the uniformity of the currency. Jackson answered it with a sentence about the rich and the potent bending the axe of government to their selfish purposes. Only one of those is an argument you can win an election with, and the country got the monetary system that followed from it. The bank was chartered in 1816 and gone by 1836. It took until 1913 to build a replacement, and the argument that killed it is still running. In April 1803, in Paris, an American diplomat was asked a question he had no authority to answer. Robert Livingston had been sent to France to buy a city. One city, New Orleans, and if possible the strip of Florida coast beside it. He had been given a ceiling of $10 million and instructions that were, by the standards of the age, unusually specific. Buy the port, secure the river, come home. Instead, the French foreign minister asked him what the United States would give for the whole of Louisiana. Not the port, the whole thing. 828,000 square miles of the North American interior, stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border and from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains. Land that would eventually become 15 American states in whole or in part. Livingston had no instructions covering this. He had no authority to buy it, no idea what it was worth, and no means of asking Washington what to do, because a letter to the president and a reply back would take the better part of 4 months. He made an offer anyway. It is worth sitting with how exposed that was. Livingston had no way to verify that the offer was genuine, rather than a negotiating device. He had no way to know whether Napoleon would honor it a week later. He had no authority to commit a dollar beyond his ceiling, and every dollar above it was a personal liability in the sense that mattered to a diplomat of that era. If Washington repudiated the agreement, his career ended, and the United States was humiliated in front of Europe. He decided that the offer was real, that it would not last, and that the cost of hesitating exceeded the cost of exceeding his instructions. Then he committed his country to a sum it did not have, for a territory nobody had measured, and waited 2 months to find out whether his president agreed. What followed was the largest land transfer by purchase in recorded history, concluded in under 3 weeks by 2 men acting well beyond their brief, for a country that did not have the money, from an emperor who did not clearly own what he was selling, under a constitution that did not permit the buyer to make the purchase. And then there is the part of the story that almost never gets told, which is where the $15 million actually came from. Because the United States did not have $15 million, it did not have anything close. The federal government's entire annual revenue at the time was around $10 million. The money came from a bank in London, which is to say, at the precise moment Britain was going back to war with France, British finance underwrote the payment that filled Napoleon's war chest. This is the story of how that happened. Start with what Jefferson actually wanted, because the modern telling makes him look far more visionary than the record supports. He was not trying to double the size of the country. He was trying to solve a specific and pressing commercial problem, and the problem was a river. In 1803, the United States stopped at the Mississippi. Everything west of it was foreign. But the country had been pushing settlers into the Ohio and Tennessee valleys for 20 years, and those settlers had a geography problem that no amount of politics could fix. There were no roads worth the name across the Appalachians. Moving a season's grain or tobacco or whiskey east over the mountains cost more than the goods were worth. So everything went downstream. Flatboats down the Ohio, into the Mississippi, and down to New Orleans, where the cargo was transferred to ocean-going ships and sold. For the entire American West, which then meant Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, New Orleans was not a foreign city they traded with. It was the only door out. And it belonged to Spain. It is worth knowing what New Orleans actually was in 1803, because the modern instinct is to picture a small colonial outpost, and that is wrong. It was a working port of perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 people, and the volume moving through it was enormous relative to the size of the American economy. Flour, tobacco, hemp, salted pork, lead from the Missouri diggings, furs from the upper river, the produce of an entire interior arriving on flatboats that were themselves broken up and sold for timber, because they could not be sailed back upstream against the current. Crews walked home, hundreds of miles up the Natchez Trace. The population was not American, and not really French either. It was a layered city, a French-speaking Creole elite, a Spanish colonial administration that had governed for 40 years, a large enslaved population, and an unusually substantial community of free people of color with property and standing that had no equivalent anywhere in the United States. Its legal system was continental, not English common law, a distinction that survives in Louisiana's civil code today. So when the Americans talked about buying New Orleans, they were not talking about acquiring a village with a good harbor. They were talking about buying the choke point of a continental river system and inheriting a city that would be, on the day of transfer, one of the more significant and least American places in the United States. The arrangement had held because of a treaty signed in 1795, which gave Americans what was called the right of deposit, the right to bring goods down the river, offload them at New Orleans, and store them there while waiting for a ship without paying duty. It was a technical provision in a minor treaty, and it was, in practical terms, the economic constitution of half the country. In October 1802, the Spanish administrator at New Orleans revoked it. The effect was immediate. Produce piled up on the levee with nowhere to go. Prices collapsed in Kentucky and Tennessee. And the political reaction in the West was not measured. There was open talk of raising a militia, taking New Orleans by force, and presenting Washington with the result. Some of that talk came from men in Congress. Then came worse news. Spain had not simply changed its mind. Spain had secretly transferred Louisiana back to France in 1800, in a treaty at San Ildefonso that Washington had only heard rumors of. The revocation of the right of deposit was the visible edge of a much larger fact. The entire western frontier of the United States was about to be handed from a weak, declining Spain to the most aggressive military power on earth. Jefferson understood exactly what that meant. He wrote that the day France took possession of New Orleans, the United States would have to marry itself to the British fleet, an extraordinary thing for him to write, given that he had spent his political life as the most pro-French figure in American politics. So he sent James Monroe to Paris to join Livingston, with authority to spend up to $10 million on New Orleans and the Floridas. If France refused, they were to cross to London and open talks about an alliance. That is the whole of the American ambition in the spring of 1803. A port, a river mouth, and a strip of coast. Nobody in Washington was contemplating the purchase of a continent. Which raises the real question of this story. Why did Napoleon offer one? The conventional answer is that he needed money for the coming war with Britain, and that is true but incomplete. The fuller answer involves an island, a disease, and the most consequential military defeat of his career, one that is barely mentioned in most accounts of his life. France's interest in Louisiana was never really about Louisiana. It was about Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue, the western third of the island of Hispaniola, today Haiti, was the single most profitable colony in the world. Not one of the most profitable, the most. Its sugar and coffee plantations produced a substantial share of the world's supply and generated more wealth for France than every other French possession combined. That wealth rested entirely on the labor of enslaved people, held in conditions so lethal that the population had to be continuously replenished by the slave trade to be maintained at all. In 1791, the enslaved population revolted. The revolution that followed ran for over a decade, through the collapse of French royal authority, through British and Spanish invasions, and through the rise of Toussaint Louverture, who by 1801 governed the colony in all but name. The man who broke that system deserves more than a passing mention, because his decisions determined the map of the United States more directly than any Americans. Toussaint Louverture had been born into slavery on a plantation in the north of the colony and was freed in his 30s. When the revolt began, he was around 50, an age at which most men's lives are settled, and he emerged from it as the most capable general in the Caribbean. What made him formidable was not battlefield brilliance alone. It was that he understood the strategic position better than the Europeans did. He allied with Spain against France, then switched to France when France abolished slavery in 1794, then expelled the British when they invaded, then governed the colony as a French officer while conducting foreign policy as though he headed a state. He negotiated trade agreements with the United States and with Britain directly. By 1801, he had promulgated a constitution for the colony that abolished slavery permanently, declared himself governor for life, and gave France no meaningful role in its administration. It did not formally declare independence. In every practical respect, it announced it. Napoleon's response was the expedition, and its stated purpose was not initially the restoration of slavery. That was concealed, because admitting it would have united the entire population against the landing. Toussaint was eventually taken by a ruse, invited to a meeting under a guarantee of safe conduct, seized and shipped to France. He was imprisoned in a fortress in the Jura Mountains at altitude in winter and died there in April 1803, the same month. As it happens, that the Louisiana negotiation was taking place in Paris. He did not live to see either outcome. But the resistance he had built outlived him, and it was that resistance, combined with the fever, that destroyed the expedition. Jean-Jacques Dessalines completed what Toussaint had begun and declared independence on the 1st of January, 1804. There is a line of causation here that is worth stating plainly, because it is usually left implicit. The largest expansion of the United States was made possible by the successful revolt of enslaved people against a European empire. Napoleon sold Louisiana because he had lost Haiti. Had the expedition succeeded, the French-American Empire proceeds as planned. Louisiana stays French, and the map of North America is a different map entirely. Louisiana's role in French strategy was to be the granary that fed Saint-Domingue. The Mississippi Valley would grow the food, the island would grow the sugar, the system would sustain a French empire in the Americas. Louisiana was the supporting act. So in late 1801, Napoleon sent an expedition to retake the island, under General Charles Leclerc, his brother-in-law. It was not a small force. Over the course of the campaign, France committed tens of thousands of troops, one of the largest expeditionary efforts of the era. It was destroyed, partly by the resistance, which was ferocious and well led, but mostly by yellow fever. European soldiers arriving in the Caribbean had no immunity, and the disease moved through the expedition in waves. Leclerc himself died of it in November 1802. The scale of the loss is genuinely difficult to comprehend. The great majority of the men sent never came home, and most of them were killed by mosquitoes rather than by any human enemy. By the beginning of 1803, Napoleon understood that Saint-Domingue was gone. The colony declared independence as Haiti at the end of 1803. And the moment the island was lost, Louisiana became worthless to France. Understand what it was without Saint-Domingue. An enormous, largely unmapped territory, thinly held, thousands of miles from France, with no significant French population, reachable only by sea lanes the Royal Navy could close at will. It could not be defended. It generated no revenue. And war with Britain was weeks away. The Peace of Amiens was collapsing and would formally end in May 1803. In a war with Britain, Louisiana was not an asset. It was a liability that would be captured, at no cost to Britain, the moment fighting began. Napoleon would lose it anyway and get nothing for it. Seen that way, the decision to sell is not a blunder or a stroke of American luck. It is the correct reading of a bad position. He held an asset he could not defend, could not use, and was about to lose. There was exactly one buyer, and that buyer had a specific and urgent reason to pay. He sold it to the only party who could not take it from him by force. The negotiation itself was extraordinarily fast. On the 11th of April, 1803, Talleyrand put the question to Livingston: what would the United States give for the whole of Louisiana? Livingston, entirely without instructions, suggested a figure. Monroe arrived the following day. The actual bargaining was handled on the French side by François Barbé-Marbois, the finance minister, who was more straightforward than Talleyrand and who Napoleon appears to have trusted with the numbers. The French opened at a figure the Americans could not contemplate. The Americans countered. Within a fortnight they had settled. The final price was $15 million, structured in two parts. $11.25 million was payment to France for the territory. The remaining $3.75 million was the United States assuming the claims of its own citizens against the French government. Debts France owed to American merchants for ships and cargo seized during the undeclared naval conflict of the late 1790s. That second portion cost France nothing in cash. It simply transferred an obligation it was not paying anyway. The treaty was signed on the 30th of April, 1803, and backdated. Livingston, who had spent years achieving nothing in Paris, and then in 3 weeks acquired a continent, is recorded as saying that from that day the United States would take its place among the powers of the first rank. He was aware, correctly, that he had just done the most important thing he would ever do. He was also aware that he had done it without permission. Which brings us to the constitutional problem, and it is a genuine one, not a footnote. Thomas Jefferson had built his entire political career on a specific reading of the Constitution, that the federal government possessed only those powers explicitly granted to it, and that any power not written down did not exist. He had used this argument to oppose Hamilton's National Bank. He had used it repeatedly against the Federalists. It was not a convenient position. It was the organizing principle of his party. The Constitution does not grant the federal government the power to purchase foreign territory. It is not there. There is no clause. Jefferson knew this immediately, and it troubled him seriously. He drafted a constitutional amendment to authorize the acquisition retrospectively. He circulated it. He argued for it. And then he dropped it because he was told, plausibly, that Napoleon might change his mind, and that the months required to pass an amendment were months the offer might not survive. So the strictest constructionist in American politics executed the largest expansion of federal power in the country's history, on the basis that the Constitution's treaty-making clause could probably be read broadly enough to cover it. His own private correspondence shows him uncomfortable about this for years afterwards. The opposition it produced is worth examining because it was more serious than the eventual vote suggests. The Federalists, the party of Hamilton, Adams, and New England commerce, attacked the purchase on 3 grounds, and only one of them was the constitutional argument. The second was fiscal. $15 million was a colossal sum against a federal revenue of 10 or 11 million. Jefferson had come to office promising to reduce the national debt, cut the Army and Navy, and shrink the government. He was now proposing to roughly double the outstanding debt in a single transaction, for territory nobody had surveyed. Set aside the politics, and that is a reasonable objection from anyone who took the debt seriously. The third was the one that actually mattered to them, and it was sectional arithmetic. New England's political weight depended on its share of a fixed-size country. Every state carved out of the West would send senators, and those senators would not be from New England. The purchase guaranteed the permanent, structural decline of New England's influence in the federal government, not through any policy, simply through the addition of land. Some Federalists said so openly. There was talk in New England of a Northern Confederacy, of secession, seriously discussed among senior figures, on the basis that a republic stretching to the Rockies was not the republic they had signed up to, and that their region would be governed by strangers. The plotting came to nothing, partly because Alexander Hamilton would not support it, but it was real, and it is a useful corrective to the idea that the purchase was universally celebrated. Timothy Pickering, a senator from Massachusetts and a former Secretary of State, was among those who considered separation preferable. That is not a fringe figure. The Senate ratified in October 1803 by 24 votes to 7. The margin was comfortable because Jefferson's party held the chamber, not because the objections had been answered. They had simply been outvoted, and the objectors were right about the consequence even though they lost the argument. New England's relative power did decline permanently from that moment. Now to the part of this story that gets left out of every school textbook, which is how it was paid for. The United States in 1803 had annual federal revenue of roughly $10 to $11 million, drawn almost entirely from customs duties. The purchase price was $15 million. There was no mechanism by which the Treasury could produce that sum in cash, and Napoleon was not interested in installments spread over a decade. He was about to fight Britain, and he wanted money now. So the United States did what a government does when it needs money it does not have. It issued bonds as 6% stock, redeemable over 15 years. But a bond is only money if somebody buys it. And in 1803, the United States was a 20-year-old republic with a checkered credit history, no central bank of the kind Europe understood, and a currency nobody in Paris wanted. The market for American government debt was not in America, it was in Europe. The bonds were taken up by two houses, Baring Brothers of London and Hope and Company of Amsterdam. Alexander Baring traveled to Paris personally to arrange it. The structure was straightforward in outline. The American bonds were delivered to the bankers paid France, and the bankers then held or placed the debt with European investors, taking their profit on the discount. France did not receive $15 million in cash. It received a substantially smaller sum, paid promptly, which is what it actually wanted. The reported figure is in the region of $8 to $9 million delivered to the French Treasury. It is worth slowing down on who these houses were, because they are the actual protagonists of the financial half of this story, and almost nobody knows their names. Baring Brothers had been founded in London in the 1760s by the sons of a German cloth merchant who had settled in Exeter. By 1803, it was among the most powerful private banks in the world, the house that governments went to when they needed to raise money across borders. Its business was sovereign lending, taking the debt of states, placing it with investors, and taking a cut of the difference. A generation later, a French statesman would describe the six great powers of Europe as England, France, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and Baring Brothers, and it was not entirely a joke. Hope and Company of Amsterdam was older still, and had been the dominant house in European sovereign finance for much of the 18th century. Amsterdam was where continental capital pooled, and Hope was where it was directed. The two houses had worked together before and were closely linked. The Napoleonic disruption of Amsterdam had pushed a good deal of Hope's business toward London. Alexander Baring, the son of the founder, was the one who traveled to Paris to close the arrangement. He was in his late 20s. He also had a personal stake in American matters that is worth knowing. He had spent time in the United States in the 1790s, had bought a very large tract of land in Maine, and had married the daughter of a Philadelphia senator. He was not a neutral banker looking at an unfamiliar country. He knew the American credit position firsthand, which is precisely why he was willing to take the paper when others might not have been. The mechanics were these. The United States issued 6% stock. Baring and Hope took the bonds at a discount. The reported terms put it around 78.5 cents on the dollar. They then paid France in cash and placed the American debt with European investors over the following years. Read that structure carefully, because it explains the gap between the price and the payment. France was not paid $15 million. France was paid what the bonds fetched at a discount promptly, in a form it could spend, something in the region of $8 to $9 million. The remaining value went in the discount to the bankers and in the assumed claims. The United States, meanwhile, owed the full face amount plus 15 years of interest. That spread is the banker's return, and it was substantial. It is also exactly what a sovereign borrower pays when it needs a very large sum quickly, has no domestic capital market to draw on, and has only one realistic set of counterparties. The United States was not cheated. The terms were normal for the period and the position. But it is worth being clear that the celebrated 3 cents an acre was a price agreed between governments, and that a considerable amount of value was distributed to private houses in the course of turning that price into money. Now consider the date. Britain and France returned to war in May 1803, the same month the ink dried on the treaty. Baring Brothers was a British bank, operating in London, under a British government that was mobilizing for a war it expected to be existential. And that bank was, in effect, handing Napoleon Bonaparte a large sum of ready cash at the moment he needed it to prosecute that war. The British government knew. Baring sought and obtained the approval of the Prime Minister, Henry Addington, before proceeding. The reasoning was strategic rather than sentimental. British ministers had concluded that a Louisiana in French hands was a permanent threat, that a Louisiana in American hands was a commercial opportunity and a strategic irrelevance, and that removing France from the North American mainland was worth more than the cash was worth to Napoleon's war effort. That may well have been correct. It is also one of the more remarkable decisions in financial history, a wartime government permitting its own bankers to fund its enemy, because the thing being bought was worth more than the money being paid. And it is worth asking what Napoleon actually did with it, because the answer sharpens the irony considerably. The money arrived as he was assembling the Armée d'Angleterre, the Army of England, on the Channel coast around Boulogne. Through 1803 and 1804, he concentrated well over 100,000 men there, together with a flotilla of flat-bottomed invasion craft built specifically to cross the Channel and land them in Kent. It was the most serious invasion threat Britain had faced since 1588, and it was taken entirely seriously at the time. Britain built the Martello Towers along the south coast and the Royal Military Canal in direct response. So the sequence is this. A London bank, with the written approval of the British Prime Minister, delivered cash to Napoleon in 1803. Napoleon spent that period building an army and a fleet whose declared purpose was the invasion of Britain. It never came. The invasion was abandoned in 1805 when the naval position made it impossible, and Trafalgar settled the question in October of that year. But nobody in 1803 knew that it would fail, and the British government approved the transaction anyway. That is either an extraordinary piece of strategic clarity, accepting a short-term risk to permanently remove France from North America, or an extraordinary piece of luck that has been retrospectively dressed up as judgment. The honest answer is probably that it was both, and that the distinction only becomes visible after the fact. There was one more problem, and it is almost comic. Nobody could say what had been bought. The treaty described the territory as having the same extent that it now has in the hands of Spain, and that it had when France possessed it. That is not a boundary, it is a shrug in legal form. Livingston asked Talleyrand directly what the eastern and western limits were. Talleyrand's reply has been repeated ever since, and it is worth quoting because it tells you exactly how the French regarded the transaction. He said that he could not give them a better direction than they already had, and that he supposed they would make the most of it. He was telling the Americans, in the politest possible terms, that France was selling a claim of undefined extent and had no intention of clarifying it. Whatever they could subsequently argue for, they were welcome to argue for. That vagueness produced decades of dispute. Did the purchase include West Florida, the Gulf Coast strip running east from New Orleans? The United States said yes, and eventually simply occupied it. Spain said no, and was in a poor position to insist. Where was the western limit? The treaty implied the watershed of the Mississippi, which meant the boundary depended on hydrology that had not been surveyed. The line with Spanish territory in the southwest was not settled until 1819, and the northern boundary with British North America not until 1818. Spain, meanwhile, protested the sale outright. When France had acquired Louisiana at San Ildefonso in 1800, it had undertaken not to transfer the territory to any third power. Selling it to the United States 3 years later was, on the face of it, a breach of that undertaking. The Spanish government said so formally. It made no difference. Spain lacked the means to contest it, and France was not interested in the argument. The transaction proceeded over a valid objection from the party that had handed the territory over in the first place, which is a reasonable summary of how international law functioned when one participant had the largest army in Europe. The handover itself, when it came, was one of the stranger ceremonies in American history. Spain had never actually vacated. France had acquired Louisiana on paper in 1800, but had never taken possession. The Spanish colonial administration simply carried on. So before the United States could take control, France had to receive the territory it had already sold. In late November 1803, at New Orleans, the Spanish flag came down and the French flag went up, and a French official took possession of a colony his government had disposed of 7 months earlier. 20 days later, on the 20th of December, the French flag came down and the American flag went up. 3 sovereigns in under 3 weeks, for a territory none of them had surveyed, in a city whose population, French, Spanish, African, Creole, few of them consulted, woke up American without having moved. The arithmetic afterwards is worth setting out properly, because the famous figure is misleading. $15 million for 828,000 square miles works out at roughly 3 cents an acre. That is the number everybody quotes. But $15 million was the price, not the cost. The bonds carried 6% interest over 15 years, and by the time the debt was fully retired, the United States had paid out something in the region of $23 million, and by some accountings higher. So the real figure is closer to 4 or 5 cents an acre, which does not change the conclusion in the slightest. At any of those numbers it remains, in pure price per value terms, the most advantageous transaction the United States has ever made. The territory contained the Great Plains, the Missouri River system, the port of New Orleans, and beneath a portion of it, though nobody knew or cared in 1803, a great deal of oil. There was then the question of what to do with the people, and it exposed something awkward about the whole enterprise. The treaty committed the United States to admitting the inhabitants, as soon as possible, according to the principles of the federal Constitution, to the enjoyment of all the rights, advantages, and immunities of citizens. That is a promise of citizenship, written into a binding international agreement. It was not kept promptly. Congress divided the purchase in 1804 into the territory of Orleans in the south and the District of Louisiana to the north, and governed Orleans through an appointed governor and an appointed council. No elected legislature at all in the first instance. The residents of New Orleans, who included men of property, education, and considerable commercial sophistication, found themselves with less say in their own government than they had enjoyed under Spain. They petitioned. A delegation went to Washington in 1804 carrying a formal remonstrance, pointing out with some precision that they had been promised the rights of citizens and had been given an administration they did not choose, conducted in a language most of them did not speak, under a legal system foreign to the one they had used all their lives. It worked slowly. An elected legislature followed in 1805, and Louisiana became a state in 1812, the first carved out of the purchase. But the episode is worth noting because it is the first time the United States had to work out what to do with a large population acquired rather than settled. Every previous expansion had been into land the government regarded, however inaccurately, as available. This was different. A functioning society with its own laws, language, and elite, transferred by treaty between two other powers, and then governed by a republic whose founding argument had been that government requires the consent of the governed. The people of New Orleans were not asked. Nor, needless to say, were the many thousands of enslaved people in the territory, whose status the purchase simply carried forward, or the indigenous nations across the whole of the interior. Jefferson, to his credit, understood that he had bought something nobody could describe, and moved immediately to find out what it was. He had actually asked Congress for money to explore the Missouri in January 1803, months before the purchase was even contemplated, in a confidential message, on the basis that it would be a commercial expedition into what was then foreign territory. Congress approved a modest sum. By the time Meriwether Lewis and William Clark set out in 1804, the land they were sent to examine had become American, and the mission had changed from reconnaissance of a neighbor into a survey of property. They were gone until 1806. What they brought back was the first systematic account of the interior, river systems, mountain passes, distances, the nations who lived there, and the confirmation of something Jefferson had privately hoped was false, that there was no easy water route to the Pacific. The Rockies were not a ridge to be crossed in a day. The continent was much harder country than the purchase had assumed. That expedition is usually told as an adventure. It is more useful to see it as due diligence conducted after settlement, the buyer surveying the asset 2 years after paying for it, and discovering that the geography did not match the assumptions used to justify the price. There is also a consequence of this purchase that took 60 years to detonate, and it belongs in the story. Louisiana was not simply land. It was future states, and every future state would eventually have to answer a question the Constitution had deliberately left unresolved. Would slavery be permitted there? Before 1803, that question had natural limits, because the country had a finite amount of territory and a rough balance between the sections. The purchase removed the limit. It created an enormous reserve of unorganized land, and it guaranteed that every decade for the next half-century American politics would have to fight over the status of the next piece of it. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was the first attempt to settle it, admitting Missouri as a slave state, Maine as a free one, and drawing a line across the remaining Louisiana territory above which slavery would be excluded. That line held for 34 years and was then destroyed by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which reopened territory the compromise had closed and produced armed conflict in Kansas that is reasonably regarded as the opening phase of the Civil War. None of that was foreseen in 1803, and it would be unfair to say Jefferson should have foreseen it. But it is the largest single consequence of the transaction, and it is not the one the 3 cents an acre figure captures. He bought the territory that made the sectional crisis unavoidable. And there is a harder point that belongs in an honest account. The land was not empty. It was occupied by many nations of indigenous people whose presence, claims, and sovereignty formed no part of the negotiation whatsoever. What France sold and the United States bought was not the land itself, but a European claim to it, the exclusive right, as against other European powers, to acquire it. Every actual acquisition of the ground came afterwards, through treaties made under pressure, through purchase, and through force over the following century. The 3 cents an acre bought the right to begin that process, without a European rival interfering. It did not buy the ground. The ground was taken separately, and the people living on it paid a price that appears nowhere in the 15 million. It is also worth putting the 15 million into some kind of proportion, because the number is meaningless in isolation. Against federal revenue of roughly 10 to 11 million a year, the purchase was about 1.5 years of the entire income of the United States government. Applied to a modern government at similar proportions, it would be a transaction running into trillions. Against the national debt, which stood somewhere around $80 million, it was an increase of nearly 20% in a single stroke, by a president elected on a promise to pay the debt down. And against what else was available to buy, $15 million in 1803 would have built a very substantial navy. The frigates that had been constructed in the 1790s, the ships that made the American Navy respectable, including the Constitution, had cost in the region of $300,000 each. 15 million was, very roughly, an entire fleet. That comparison is the one that makes the decision look sharpest in hindsight. Jefferson chose territory over force. He bought the thing that could not be taken from him later rather than the thing that could be sunk. Given that he was also busy cutting the navy he already had, the choice was consistent with his instincts as well as, in the event, correct. Whether he saw it that clearly at the time is another matter. He had authorized 10 million for a city and got a continent for 15, which is less a strategy than an opportunity taken quickly by men who could not consult him. So what is the lesson for a channel about how money shapes countries? The first is about timing, and it is the least comfortable. The United States did not get this territory because it was strong, wealthy, or clever. It got it because, for a window of a few months, a stronger power urgently needed cash and held an asset it could not defend. Napoleon did not underestimate the value of Louisiana. He correctly estimated that he was going to lose it. America's advantage was not power. It was being the only available counterparty at the moment the seller was forced. The second is about credit, and it is the one that matters most. Jefferson's party had spent a decade attacking Hamilton's financial architecture, the funding of the national debt, the bank, the whole apparatus of public credit. In 1803, that architecture was the only reason the purchase was possible. American bonds were saleable in London and Amsterdam, because Hamilton had spent the 1790s establishing that the United States paid its debts. Without that reputation, built deliberately and at political cost by a man Jefferson despised, there is no financing, and without financing there is no purchase. The party that opposed public credit doubled the country using it. And the third is the one that recurs through every story on this channel. The decisive actors were not the governments. Two banking houses, one in London and one in Amsterdam, determined whether the largest land transfer in history could be completed, and one of them was operating from the capital of a nation at war with the recipient of the money. Governments made the decision. Finance determined whether the decision was possible. That order of operations has not changed since. In the summer of 1925, the roads into Florida were so congested that the state was, in places, effectively full. Cars queued at the Georgia line. Hotels in Jacksonville rented out lobby chairs by the night. In Miami, men slept in shifts in rooming houses and paid for the privilege. And the railway that served the eastern coast of the state stopped accepting freight because its yards were so choked with unloaded boxcars that nothing could move. They were not coming for the weather, or not principally. They were coming to buy land, and most of them had no intention of ever seeing it. 3 years before the Wall Street crash, in a state with a population smaller than Brooklyn's, America ran the entire experiment. The leverage, The paper instrument that made the leverage possible, the promotional machinery, the celebrity endorsement, the outright fraud at the edges, the sudden absence of new buyers, and the discovery, always the same discovery, that a market can stop long before anybody rings a bell. This is the story of the Florida land boom, which is the most instructive American bubble precisely because it is the least famous. The instrument at the center of it was called a binder, and everything else follows from how it worked. A binder was an option. You agreed to buy a parcel of land, you signed a contract, and you put down a deposit, often around 10%, sometimes considerably less. The balance became due at a specified date, typically 30 days out, when the deed would be recorded and the transaction completed. What made it explosive was that the binder itself was assignable. In the interval before payment fell due, you could sell your contract to somebody else, who took on your obligation and paid you the difference between what you had agreed to pay and what they had agreed to pay you. You never owned the land. You never paid the balance. You owned a promise for 30 days and you sold the promise. Do the arithmetic on that, and the appeal is obvious. A 10% deposit means that a 10% rise in the land's price doubles your money. A 20% rise triples it. In a market climbing steadily every week, the binder was a machine for converting a small amount of cash into a large amount of cash, provided only that somebody stood behind you willing to take the contract off your hands before the 30 days elapsed. The young men who traded them were called binder boys. They arrived by the trainload in knickerbockers because of the heat, and they worked the streets and the hotel lobbies and the queues outside the sales offices, buying and reselling contracts, sometimes several times in a single day. A parcel of land could change hands 5 or 6 times before anybody recorded a deed on it, and every one of those transfers registered as a sale at a higher price. That last point is the mechanism worth carrying away from this entire episode. The price series that everybody watched, the one printed in the papers, the one that proved the market was rising, was generated almost entirely by people who never intended to own anything. It measured the enthusiasm of intermediaries, not the demand of occupants. Miami had something like 2,000 real estate offices by 1925, staffed by an estimated 25,000 salespeople, in a city whose entire population had recently been a fraction of that number multiplied a few times over. Nearly everybody in the town was selling land to nearly everybody else in the town. Building permits in Miami came to around $60 million in 1925, in a year when the same figure for cities several times its size was a fraction of that. A single newspaper carried more advertising in 1925 than any newspaper anywhere in the world had carried in a year, so thick with real estate pages that it had to be broken into sections merely to be handled. Now, how a swamp became the most desirable land in America. None of it would have been possible without 2 men who were already dead or finished by the time the boom began. Henry Flagler, who had been one of Rockefeller's partners in Standard Oil, spent the last 3 decades of his life pushing a railway down the east coast of Florida and building a hotel at the end of each new stretch of track, St. Augustine, then Palm Beach. Then, in 1896, a settlement on Biscayne Bay that was incorporated as Miami largely because he had arrived. Henry Plant did the equivalent work on the Gulf side. Flagler's final act was the most extravagant railway project in American history, an extension running out over the water from the mainland to Key West, across open sea on viaducts and embankments, completed in 1912. He rode the first train down and died the following year. It is worth remembering that scale of ambition when the developers of the 1920s appear reckless. They were operating in a state whose entire modern existence had been produced by a man building a railroad into the ocean. What Flagler and Plant had created was access. What the 1920s added was mass access, and the difference between those two things is the whole boom. A railway carries the people who can afford a hotel at the end of it. A road carries everybody, in their own car with their own possessions, whenever they feel like leaving. The people who came that way even had a name. They were the tin can tourists, driving south with their food in cans and their tents on the running boards, camping in municipal grounds that Florida towns built specifically to receive them. They were not, on arrival, rich, but a very large number of them looked at the place and decided to find some money. Carl Fisher had made his money in automobile headlights, selling a compressed gas lamp system to the car industry, and then selling the company to Union Carbide, and he had spent a good deal of it on the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and on the Dixie Highway, a road running south from the Midwest towards Florida. He is the model of a certain kind of American operator, a promoter who genuinely builds the thing. What he built was Miami Beach. The barrier island east of Miami was mangrove swamp, and Fisher dredged the bay bottom and pumped it ashore to make dry land, cleared the mangroves, laid streets, planted imported topsoil and put up hotels, polo grounds and a golf course. Then he advertised it relentlessly to the north, most famously with an electric sign in Times Square reading, in the middle of a New York winter, that it was June in Miami. That is the boom's first ingredient, and it is real rather than fraudulent. Fisher's land had genuinely not existed a few years earlier, and now it did, and it was genuinely valuable. The problem with a boom is never that its founding proposition is false. It is that a true proposition, extended by leverage to people who cannot evaluate it, becomes indistinguishable from a false one. George Merrick was building something quite different and rather more admirable. His development southwest of Miami was called Coral Gables, and it was planned in the Mediterranean revival style with genuine coherence, architectural controls, plazas, entrances, a grand hotel, a university endowed with his own land, and a canal system. Merrick was not selling raw acreage. He was selling a designed city, and much of what he built is still standing and still pleasant to walk around, which cannot be said of most speculative development of any era. The Venetian pool, cut out of a coral rock quarry, is still open. To sell it, he assembled the most extraordinary marketing operation of the decade. Fleets of buses bringing prospects down from the north, orchestras, free lunches, and a speaker. William Jennings Bryan had been Secretary of State, and 3 times the Democratic nominee for president, and the most famous orator in the United States for 30 years. He had prosecuted the Scopes trial in Tennessee in the summer of 1925, and died a few days after it ended. In the years before that, he sat on a platform beside the water at the Venetian pool in Coral Gables and lectured crowds on the merits of Florida real estate. He was paid a reported $100,000 a year for it, half in cash and half in land, which tells you both what the promoters thought his voice was worth and how much of the local economy was denominated in the thing being sold. A man of enormous public standing was being compensated, in part, with the very asset he was promoting, so that his personal fortune depended on the audience believing him. Addison Misner was an architect of enormous charm, considerable talent, and no financial discipline whatsoever. He had made Palm Beach look the way Palm Beach looks, inventing a Spanish Mediterranean idiom out of a genuinely deep knowledge of Iberian building and a willingness to fake anything he could not source. His workshops manufactured antique roof tiles and distressed ironwork to order. In 1925, he launched Boca Raton, which was to be the most luxurious resort in the world, with a 100-foot-wide boulevard, a cathedral, and a hotel. He raised money on the strength of his name, and a list of investors that included some of the most recognizable families in America. He got a hotel built. The rest of it went down with the boom, and the company failed the following year. D.P. Davis dredged 2 islands out of Tampa Bay, on the other side of the state, and produced the single purest illustration of the whole phenomenon. He was selling building lots on land that, at the moment of sale, was still underwater. The fill had been surveyed and platted but not yet pumped. 300 lots went in 3 hours. People queued overnight and bought parcels they could not stand on the strength of a plan and a dredge. It worked in the sense that the islands were in fact completed and are a pleasant part of Tampa today. It also tells you the exact temperature of the market. Buyers had stopped requiring the land to exist. Now the reasons it happened here, because the boom was not arbitrary and Florida was not chosen at random. The first reason is the automobile. In 1920, there were a few million cars in America. By the middle of the decade, there were far more, and they had turned a 2-day rail journey into something a middle-class family could do themselves, with their possessions, on roads that were being built specifically to bring them. The second is that the American middle class had money and a new relationship with credit. Installment buying had normalized the idea of paying for a thing over time while enjoying it now, and the stock market had been rising, and there was a general and not unreasonable sense that the country had entered a period of permanent prosperity. The third is that Florida made itself deliberately attractive to wealth. Florida had amended its constitution in 1924 to prohibit exactly the taxes that were rising elsewhere. No state income tax and no inheritance tax shall be levied. That was aimed directly at rich Northerners deciding where to establish residence, and it worked, and it is still working a century later. There is a fourth reason, and it is macroeconomic rather than local. American credit was unusually cheap in 1924 and 1925, and part of the reason had nothing to do with Florida or even with America. The Federal Reserve had eased deliberately in 1924, with an eye on helping Britain return to the gold standard at the pre-war parity. A lower American interest rate made it easier for gold to stay in London, rather than being pulled across the Atlantic. Whatever the merits of that as international policy, the domestic consequence was a wall of cheap money looking for a return in a country that already believed it had entered a permanent boom. It went into installment credit, into equities, and into Florida. It is a pattern worth noticing whenever a national mania appears to be about one asset. The asset is where the money went, not why there was money. Nor were the people describing the boom neutral observers of it. The newspapers carrying those record volumes of real estate advertising were, by 1925, financially dependent on the thing they were reporting. That does not require anybody to be corrupt. It only requires an editor to be enthusiastic about the industry paying for the presses, which is the natural human response and requires no encouragement at all. And the last of them is the simplest. The winters are warm, the state is long and coastal, and a very large number of Americans genuinely did want to live there. The boom was not built on a lie. It was built on a truth that arrived 30 years early and was financed as if it had arrived already. The selling machinery deserves its own description because it was industrialized in a way that would not look out of place today. A prospect in Ohio or New York would answer an advertisement and be brought south, frequently at the developer's expense, on a chartered bus or railway car. On arrival, they were fed, entertained, given a tour, and delivered to a platform where a speaker, sometimes a famous one, explained what Florida was about to become. Then they were walked onto the property itself, where salesmen worked the crowd individually, and where a band and a free lunch were doing the emotional work that the balance sheet could not. The instrument being sold at the end of that day was a binder, which required a modest deposit and could be signed on the spot. That is the design, an afternoon of managed enthusiasm, terminating in a commitment small enough to make in the moment and legally binding enough to be worth something the next morning. And a great deal of what was sold that way did not exist in any meaningful sense. A subdivision could be created by surveying a tract, drawing streets on a plat, recording it with the county, and selling the resulting rectangles. No road had to be built, no drainage had to be dug. The plat was a legal object, and the legal object was what changed hands. Some of those developments were built, some were built decades later, and some were never built at all. The northern states noticed the money leaving and fought back, which is a part of the story almost nobody tells. Bankers' associations in the Midwest and New England ran public campaigns discouraging Florida investment. State officials warned depositors. Newspapers in Ohio and Massachusetts published dire accounts of what buyers were actually getting for their deposits. There was self-interest in it. Every dollar sent to Miami was a dollar not in a local bank, but the warnings were substantially accurate. They had no effect worth measuring. That is the recurring finding of every episode this channel covers. Accurate public warnings, issued in good time by credible institutions, are almost perfectly ineffective against a rising price. The price is the argument, and it is being made every week, and no one's pamphlet can compete with it. Where there is that much money moving on that little verification, the fraud arrives on its own. Charles Ponzi arrived in Jacksonville in 1925, having served his federal sentence for the Boston postal coupon scheme that already bore his name, and went into land. His operation was called the Charpon Land Syndicate, and it offered investors a stake in Florida property with returns that would have been remarkable if they had been possible. He was selling 23 lots to the acre, in tracts near Jacksonville, a good deal of which was swamp. An acre is roughly the size of a football field. 23 building plots in that space is not a subdivision, it is a diagram. He was indicted under Florida's trust laws, jumped bail, and was picked up in Texas trying to leave the country as a crewman on a freighter. It is worth being fair about the scale of him, though. Ponzi was a small operator in Florida, and the reason he matters is not the money he took. It is that a convicted swindler, released from prison and nationally notorious, could walk into that state and immediately find customers. When a market will buy from him, the market will buy from anybody. The first thing to break was not confidence. It was logistics, and that is the detail that gets left out of every short account of this episode. A land boom is only worth anything if the land can be built on, and building requires cement, lumber, steel, tiles, and fittings, all of which had to come into Florida from somewhere else. The state manufactured almost none of it. Everything arrived by rail down the peninsula or by ship into a handful of harbors, and by 1925, both routes had jammed solid. In August 1925, the Florida East Coast Railway declared an embargo, refusing to accept freight for shipment into the boom districts. No freight to be accepted except foodstuffs, fuel, and perishables. The railway had thousands of loaded cars sitting in its yards that nobody could unload, because there was nowhere to put the contents and no labor free to move them, and the whole system had seized. Think about what that does to a market built on binders. The value of a lot rests on the assumption that a house will stand on it. If cement cannot be delivered for 6 months, construction stops, and the man who bought a lot intending to build discovers he cannot build, and the man who bought a binder intending to sell it discovers that the buyer he was counting on has gone quiet. The embargo did not cause the collapse on its own. What it did was remove, in a single administrative act, the mechanism by which speculation was supposed to turn into houses. From August 1925 onwards, the market was running on resale alone. Then a ship turned over in the mouth of the harbor, and Miami's alternative supply route closed too. In January 1926, a Danish schooner called the Prince Valdemar, being converted into a floating hotel, capsized while under tow in the narrow entrance channel to Miami Harbor and settled across it. Nothing of size could get in or out. Salvage in those conditions was slow and awkward, and the channel stayed blocked for the better part of a month, with vessels loaded with building material anchored offshore. 2 blockages, one on rails and one on water, in a state that produced nothing it needed. By the spring of 1926, the boom was visibly over. Prices in Miami had stopped rising in the autumn of 1925, and once they stopped rising, the binder became a liability rather than an instrument. The whole point of holding one was that somebody would relieve you of it at a higher price, and when nobody did, the balance fell due and had to be found in cash. That is the specific way leverage kills. Not gradually as prices decline, but abruptly on a date, when an obligation matures and the plan for meeting it has evaporated. Binder holders defaulted in numbers. Deposits were forfeited. The sales offices emptied and the binder boys went north. It is worth pausing on how quiet the top was, because people expect a crash to announce itself. There was no panic in Miami in the autumn of 1925. There was no single day on which the market fell. What happened was that the queue thinned. The trains from the north carried fewer speculators. The sales offices had slower afternoons, and a binder that would have found a buyer in a day took 3 days, then a week, then did not find one. That is what the end of a leveraged market actually looks like from inside it, and it is why so few people get out. A crash gives you a reason to act. A slow disappearance of buyers gives you only the hope that next week will be better, which is not obviously wrong until the day the balance falls due. And then, into a market that had already broken, came the weather. The hurricane came ashore in the early hours of the 18th of September, 1926, directly over Miami. It was an extremely intense storm, and it arrived in a city that had been built at enormous speed by people with no local experience of hurricanes at all. A place whose entire population had roughly tripled in a few years, most of them newcomers who had never seen one. The most terrible detail of that night is what happened in the eye. The wind dropped, the sky cleared, and thousands of people came out into the streets in the belief that it was over. It was not over, it was half over. The second half arrived from the opposite direction and caught them outdoors. The Red Cross put the dead at 372, with more than 6,000 injured, and tens of thousands left homeless. At Moore Haven, on the southern shore of Lake Okeechobee, the low earth dike gave way, and the lake came into the town. 2 years later, a second storm crossed Lake Okeechobee in September 1928, and the dike failed on a far larger scale. The water went out across the farming settlements of the Glades and killed something in the region of 2,500 people, most of them black agricultural laborers, many of them buried in mass graves and uncounted for decades. It remains one of the deadliest natural disasters in American history, and it is very little known. The storms did not cause the collapse of the land boom. That is worth stating plainly, because the hurricane is usually given the role. The market had turned a year before the 1926 storm, for entirely financial reasons. What the hurricanes did was destroy the possibility of the recovery that everybody in Florida was waiting for, and they did it by supplying, in the most vivid way imaginable, the single fact that the promotional literature had omitted. There is one more thing to say about that storm, and it belongs to this channel subject rather than to meteorology. Miami in 1926 had no building code worth the name for wind. It had been thrown up at maximum speed by contractors working faster than any inspection regime could follow, in a state where the profitable thing was to complete and sell rather than to build well, and where almost nobody involved had lived through a hurricane. Roofs were not tied down, walls were not braced. The damage was not simply a function of the wind speed, it was a function of how the boom had built. That is the same finding London reached after 1666, and that every city reaches eventually, usually once. A construction boom sets the standard of the building stock for the next 50 years, and the moment when standards are cheapest to enforce is precisely the moment when enforcing them is least popular, because every delay costs a developer money in a rising market. The bill arrives later, in one night, and it is paid by whoever happens to be living in the houses. The consequences ran through the banking system next, in the way these things always do. Florida's banks had lent against land at boom valuations and had taken land as collateral, and when the valuations went and the borrowers went, the loans on their books were secured by parcels nobody would buy. Bank failures ran through the state and into Georgia through the interlocking chains that then characterized Southern banking, where one holding company's failure closed dozens of nominally separate institutions in a week. The way Southern banking was organized made that worse in a specific and avoidable manner. Rather than large branch networks, the region ran on chains, nominally independent banks under common ownership or interlocking control, holding deposits with one another and lending to one another's affiliates. It looked like a diversified system of many separate institutions. It behaved like one institution with many front doors. So when the largest of those chains failed in 1926, it did not take down one bank. It closed scores of them across Florida and Georgia within days, in towns that had no connection to Miami real estate whatsoever, because their local bank's reserves had been sitting in the vault of a sister institution that had lent them against platted swamp. Depositors in places that had never heard of a binder lost their savings to one. By 1928, Florida was in a depression of its own, with municipalities that had issued bonds for streets and drainage in anticipation of populations that never arrived. Several of them defaulted. Coral Gables, the best planned development of the whole boom, was in serious trouble. Merrick lost control of his company and finished his life running a real estate office and, laterally, as the county postmaster. Carl Fisher lost almost everything, partly in Florida and partly in a second scheme at Montauk on Long Island that was meant to be the northern counterpart to Miami Beach. Misner's company failed, DP. Davis went overboard from an ocean liner in the Atlantic in 1926 in circumstances that were never satisfactorily explained, having insured his life heavily. The municipal wreckage lasted longest and is the least visible part. Towns had issued bonds to pay for streets, sewers, bridges, and drainage on the strength of the population that was obviously coming, and the bonds were long and the population was not. When the tax base failed to appear, the debt service did not adjust. Florida cities defaulted through the 1930s in numbers that were extraordinary even by the standards of that decade, and several of them were still working through the consequences after the Second World War. There is also a physical residue that has never gone away. The subdivisions platted on paper in 1925 and never built remained recorded in county registries. Thousands of tiny lots, often on land that was wet, remote, or without legal access, owned by heirs of northern buyers who had long since stopped paying attention. Florida planners call them antiquated plats, and they are still a live problem. Parcels too small to build on under modern codes, with ownership scattered across generations of people who may not know they own anything at all. A speculative afternoon in 1925 produced land title problems that outlived everybody involved. Florida is worth studying because it happened first, and because everybody who lived through the second one had already seen the first. The collapse ran 3 full years ahead of Wall Street. Land prices in Miami peaked in the autumn of 1925 and were falling through 1926, when the stock market still had 3 years of climbing left to do. The same country, the same decade, the same credit conditions, the same conviction that a new era had arrived, and one part of it had already been through the entire cycle, while the other was still accelerating. That is not an argument that people are stupid. It is something more interesting and more uncomfortable. Everybody in America read about the Florida bust. It was extensively covered. The hurricane in particular was national news, and the phrase Florida real estate became a synonym for folly almost immediately. None of that transferred to the stock market, because the lesson was filed under Florida rather than under leverage, which is the general failure. A bubble teaches a very specific lesson to the people burned by it, about the particular asset that burned them, and a very general lesson to nobody. The Binder boys of 1925 did not become cautious investors. They became people who did not buy Florida land. The mechanism, a small deposit, an assignable contract, a price series generated by intermediaries who never intend to take delivery, moved on to margin accounts and did it again. The modern version of the binder is not hard to find, and it has never really gone out of use. Off-plan property is routinely sold on a deposit against completion years away, and in hot markets, those purchase contracts get assigned before the building is finished, at a profit, to buyers who assign them again. The mechanics are identical. A small sum controls a large asset, the contract is transferable, and the reported prices are set by people who have no intention of ever holding keys. It shows up in other forms too. Any market where a deposit or a margin controls a multiple of itself, and where the position can be passed on before settlement, will generate the same shape: a smooth ascent in the price series, a widening gap between the recorded transactions and the number of people who actually want the underlying thing, and a break that arrives on a settlement date rather than as a gradual decline. The tell is always the same, and it is not the price. It is the ratio between transactions and occupancy. When a market's volume is being produced by people who will never use what they are buying, the volume is not evidence of demand. It is evidence of a queue, and a queue is a structure that looks identical whether it is lengthening or about to disperse. There are 3 specific things in this story worth keeping, and they are not moral observations. The first is the price series problem. When the observable prices in a market are being set by people who never intend to hold the asset, the price is a measure of trading conditions rather than a value, and it will keep rising smoothly right up until the moment the intermediaries stop, at which point it does not decline, it stops existing. There is no orderly market on the way down because there was never a market, only a queue. The second is the physical constraint. Every asset boom that requires something to be built eventually meets the actual supply of cement, labor, land, or electricity. The financial claim can be created in seconds, and the physical thing cannot, and the gap between them is where the collapse begins. In Florida, the gap became visible as a railway embargo and a ship in a channel, which is a satisfyingly literal version of a very general phenomenon. The third is the fixed date obligation. Leverage does not kill a speculator by making them poorer as the market falls. It kills them on the day a payment is due, and it does so regardless of whether they were right about the long-run value of what they bought. Almost everybody who lost money in Florida in 1926 was correct about Florida. The state's population is now more than 20 million people, and the swamp that D.P. Davis sold underwater is a desirable address. They were right, and the date beat them. The most awkward part of the whole episode is that the physical legacy is excellent. Coral Gables is one of the better-planned communities built in America in the 20th century and is now expensive. Miami Beach exists because a headlight manufacturer pumped a bay bottom onto a mangrove swamp. Davis Islands is a desirable Tampa neighborhood. Boca Raton got its hotel. The University of Miami, endowed with Merrick's land, is still there. So the boom built real things and ruined the people who financed them, which is a more common outcome than the tidy morality tale allows. Speculative manias are not purely destructive. They are a wasteful and brutal method of getting infrastructure built early, in which the assets survive, and the first generation of owners does not. Somebody enjoys the streets and the drainage and the hotels. It is simply not the people who paid for them. That is the useful ending, and it is not a comforting one. The people who bought binders in Miami in the summer of 1925 had the correct view of the American future: warm weather, air travel, retirement migration, air conditioning, a century of Northerners moving south. They were early by about 30 years, and they had financed a 30-year view with a 30-day contract. And the difference between those two numbers is the whole of the disaster. There is one last thing worth noticing, and it concerns the word bubble itself. It implies something empty, and that is why the metaphor is misleading. Florida in 1925 was not empty. It contained dredges, cement, surveyors, architects of real ability, a genuine climate advantage, a tax regime designed to attract capital, and a demographic trend that has run in the same direction for 100 years since. Almost everything in it was solid except the terms. That is why these episodes are worth studying one at a time, rather than treating them as a single recurring folly. The question is almost never whether the underlying idea is sound. It is whether the financing matches the time the idea will take. Get that wrong, and being correct is no protection at all, which is the least intuitive lesson in the whole subject, and the one that has to be learned again in every generation. They were not wrong about Florida. They were wrong about September. Do you remember the autumn of 1998? For a fortnight that September, the news kept telling you that a fund in Connecticut, which almost nobody had heard of, might take the world's banking system down with it. You will probably remember that it was rescued. What you were almost certainly never told is that it had been right. Nearly every trade on its books eventually made money. It was destroyed anyway in 4 months by a single assumption that every one of them had got wrong. In the 4 months between May and September of 1998, a private investment fund in Greenwich, Connecticut, lost about $4.6 billion, more than 9/10 of everything it had. 2 of the people who worked there had won the Nobel Prize in Economics the previous year. On the 23rd of September, the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York put the heads of 14 of the largest financial institutions in the world into a room on Liberty Street and did not let them leave until they had agreed to buy it. No public money was spent. The Fed lent nothing and guaranteed nothing. What it did was arrange a meeting, and the reason it thought a meeting was necessary is the whole point of this story. Because the fund's positions were not, in the main, wrong, almost all of them eventually made money. This is the story of how a portfolio that was substantially correct destroyed itself anyway, and of the specific thing that everybody involved had measured incorrectly. Long-term capital management was founded in 1994 by John Meriwether, who had spent the previous 15 years at Salomon Brothers building and running the most profitable trading operation on Wall Street. His group at Salomon was called Fixed Income Arbitrage. It was small, secretive, staffed largely by academics rather than traders, and in some years it produced a substantial share of the entire firm's profits. Merriweather left Salomon in 1991 in the aftermath of a scandal on the government bond desk that he had not caused and had reported. When he set up on his own, most of that group came with him: Larry Hillebrand, Eric Rosenfeld, Victor Hagani, Greg Hawkins, men who had built the models and knew exactly which trades the models found. And then he did something that had never been done in that business. He recruited the theory itself. Myron Skoll and Robert Merton joined as principals. Between them, with the late Fisher Black, they had produced the option pricing framework that made the modern derivatives market possible. And in 1997, they shared the Nobel Prize in economics for it. David Mullins came too, and his arrival said something different again. He had been vice chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, the number 2 official in American central banking, and he left that job to join a hedge fund in Connecticut. The fund opened for business in February 1994 with about $1.25 billion, which at the time was the largest launch anybody had ever raised. The terms were correspondingly severe: a $10 million minimum, a 3-year lockup on the money, a 2% management fee, and 25% of the profits. Those are terms a manager can only demand if the investors believe the returns will be exceptional. For 4 years, they were. After fees, the fund returned roughly 20% in its opening partial year, then about 43%, then about 41%, then about 17%. So the obvious question is what they were actually doing, and the answer is much less exotic than the reputation suggests. Strip away the mathematics, and it is one idea, applied with great discipline and enormous quantities of borrowed money. The idea is convergence. Find 2 securities that are economically almost identical but trade at slightly different prices. Buy the cheap one, sell the expensive one, and wait for the gap to close, which it must, because the 2 things are the same thing. The textbook example is the American Treasury market, and it is worth walking through slowly because everything that happened later is contained in it. The Treasury issues a new 30-year bond periodically. The most recently issued one is called the on-the-run bond. It is the one everybody trades, so it is easy to buy and easy to sell in size at a good price. The bond issued 6 months earlier is nearly identical, same government, same credit, almost the same maturity, but it is no longer the one everybody trades. It has settled into portfolios. Selling a large block of it takes longer and moves the price more. Because of that, it yields slightly more. Investors pay a small premium for the liquid bond, which means the illiquid one is a fraction cheaper. The gap is small, a handful of basis points, hundredths of a percentage point. Here is what makes it a trade rather than an observation. In 6 months' time, when the Treasury issues the next bond, today's on-the-run bond becomes off-the-run itself. The premium it currently carries will disappear, because the thing being paid for is a status it is about to lose. So you sell the expensive one, buy the cheap one, and hold. The convergence is not a hope, it is close to a scheduled event. The problem is the size of the prize. A few basis points on a bond is a rounding error. To turn that into a return an investor would notice, you have to do it in a position measured in billions. And to hold a position measured in billions, you have to borrow almost all of it. Which is exactly what they did, and the borrowing was the cheapest part. Government bonds are the best collateral in the world. A dealer lending against them in the repo market takes a haircut, the margin of extra collateral that protects the lender if the price moves. For most borrowers, that haircut is a couple of percent. For long-term capital management on many trades, it was close to zero. The banks competed for the business, and the way they competed was by asking for less protection. The result was a balance sheet that is hard to hold in your head. By early 1998, the fund had roughly $4.8 billion of its own capital and something like $125 billion of assets. That is leverage of about 25 to 1. And that figure understates it because it counts only what sat on the balance sheet. The notional value of the fund's derivative contracts, swaps, options, futures, has been estimated at around $1.25 trillion. Now, 25 to 1 sounds reckless, and the defense offered at the time was serious, so it deserves to be stated properly rather than dismissed. Leverage is only dangerous in proportion to the volatility of what you own. A portfolio of technology stocks at 25 to 1 is suicide, because those prices move 10% in a week. A portfolio of near-identical government bonds hedged against each other is a different animal. The position is not a bet on interest rates. It is a bet on a tiny spread between two almost identical things. Hedged that way, the daily fluctuation of the whole portfolio was genuinely small. The risk models, value-at-risk calculations built on years of price history, said that a loss of the kind that eventually occurred was so improbable that it should not be expected within the lifetime of the universe. The second defense was diversification. This was not one trade. It was hundreds spread across countries and asset classes. Danish mortgage bonds, Italian government debt against German, swap spreads in half a dozen currencies, merger arbitrage in equities, long-dated index options. If those positions were unrelated to each other, then the portfolio's overall risk was far lower than the sum of its parts, and the leverage was justified by the diversification. That sentence is the load-bearing wall of the entire enterprise, and there is a word in it doing all the work. The word is unrelated. Hold on to it. Two of the trades are worth setting out in detail, because between them they explain everything that followed better than any summary can. The first is a pair of shares. In 1907, two oil companies, Royal Dutch Petroleum of the Netherlands and Shell Transport and Trading of Britain, merged their operations while remaining separately listed. The agreement split the combined cash flows on a fixed basis, 60% to the Dutch company, 40% to the British one. That is as close to an identity as financial markets offer. Two claims on the same set of assets in a fixed and permanent ratio. The prices should therefore stand in that same ratio, always. They did not. For decades, the two shares deviated from the 60-40 relationship, sometimes by several percent, occasionally by considerably more, with the Dutch shares generally the expensive ones. The gap moved around for reasons that had nothing to do with oil, which index each share sat in, which countries investors were buying, tax treatment of dividends. To a convergence trader, this is close to a gift. Sell the expensive claim, buy the cheap one in the correct proportion, hold and collect when the market notices its own absurdity. The fund put on the trade in size. The gap did not close. During 1998, it widened, which produced losses on a position that was, in the most literal sense, arithmetically correct. And it stayed wide for years afterward. The two shares did not finally converge until the companies formally unified their structure in 2005, 7 years later. That single trade is the thesis of the entire episode. The position was right. It required a holding period of 7 years and the patience of an investor who could not be forced to sell. Long-term capital had neither. The second trade is stranger, and it took the fund a long way from bond arbitrage. It was selling long-dated options on equity indices. The reasoning was ordinary. Insurance companies and pension funds in Europe and America wanted long-dated protection against a market fall, and there were very few natural sellers of a 5-year option on a stock index. That imbalance meant the implied volatility built into the price of those options sat persistently above the volatility actually observed in the market. So the fund sold them in enormous quantity, hedging the direction and keeping the difference between implied and realized volatility. It became such a dominant supplier that traders on other desks referred to it, half seriously, as the central bank of volatility. Notice what that position is underneath. It is a promise to pay out if markets become turbulent, sold by a firm whose entire portfolio also loses money when markets become turbulent. It was not a diversifying position at all. It was a second, much larger bet on the same weather. And when the flight to quality arrived in August and September of 1998, implied volatility went to levels nobody had priced, and those options were marked against the fund on a scale that dwarfed the bond positions. The insurance policy it had written came due in exactly the week it could least afford it. Between them, the two trades show the shape of the problem. One was correct and unfundable. The other was profitable in every ordinary month and catastrophic in the single month that mattered. Neither was a mistake of arithmetic. By 1997, a different problem had appeared, and it is the one that never gets enough attention. The fund was too successful for its own strategy. Convergence trades exist because somebody is willing to pay a premium for convenience. That premium is finite. When a fund with billions of dollars puts on the trade, the spread narrows, and it narrows for everybody. The opportunity shrinks as you exploit it. By late 1997, the partners could see it happening. The trades they liked were thinner than they had been, and the fund had more money than it had good places to put it. So in December 1997, they did something that looked like admirable discipline. They returned about $2.7 billion of capital to outside investors. Look carefully at what that does. The position stayed roughly where they were. The capital supporting them was cut by more than a third. Leverage on the remaining base went up sharply. It was framed as returning money because the opportunities were shrinking, which was honest. Its effect was to make the fund considerably more fragile going into the worst year in its history, and to concentrate the exposure in the hands of the partners themselves, who kept their own money in. Then came 1998, and it began going wrong quietly. Spreads in mortgage-backed securities widened rather than narrowed in the spring. May and June produced losses, modest, unpleasant, within the range of things that happen. There was also a development elsewhere that mattered more than anyone outside a few trading floors realized. Salomon Brothers, by then owned by Travelers, shut down its bond arbitrage unit in the summer of 1998, the very desk that had spawned long-term capital. That desk held many of the same positions, because it had been built by the same people using the same logic. Closing it meant liquidating those positions into the market, which meant that the spreads long-term capital owned were being pushed the wrong way by somebody, unwinding an almost identical book. The proprietary insight, it turned out, was not proprietary. Copies of the portfolio existed in several places, and the exits were the same door. And then, on the 17th of August 1998, the government of Russia devalued the ruble and defaulted on its domestic debt. The direct exposure was survivable. The consequence was not, and the mechanism deserves to be stated in plain language, because it is the single most important thing in this entire story. When investors are frightened, they do not sell everything equally. They sell what is hard to hold and buy what is easy to sell. Money runs, all at once, toward whatever is most liquid in global markets. That means the newest American Treasury bonds, and away from everything else. Now go back through the portfolio. Long-term capital was short the liquid bond and long the illiquid one. Short the safe credit, long the risky one. Short the easy to sell, long the hard to sell in Denmark, in Italy in mortgages, in swaps, in equity volatility, in every one of those supposedly unrelated markets. Every trade in the book was a different expression of the same underlying position. Sell liquidity, buy illiquidity, collect the premium. In normal times, those trades genuinely have little to do with each other. In a flight to quality, they are one enormous bet, and it goes wrong everywhere simultaneously. That is what the models had got wrong, not the mathematics, which was fine. The assumption underneath it, that the historical correlations between these markets describe their relationship in all conditions. Correlation is not a property of a market. It is a property of who owns the positions and how much they have borrowed and what happens to them when they need cash. In a panic, everything owned by leveraged holders becomes correlated because it is all being sold by the same people for the same reason on the same afternoon. On the 21st of August 1998, the fund lost about $550 million in a single day. Over the month of August, it lost roughly 44% of its capital. On the 2nd of September, Merriweather wrote to the fund's investors and told them the number. The letter said in terms that losses of this magnitude were a shock, that the fund's positions were fundamentally sound, and that the opportunity available was now the best it had ever been, and it invited new money in on favorable terms. Every sentence of that was defensible. It was also the single worst thing that could have happened, because the letter did not stay private. Within days, its contents were circulating on trading floors, and the market now knew that a heavily leveraged fund with famous positions was badly wounded. What follows is the part of the story that anyone who has ever been in a distressed position will recognize, and it has nothing to do with mathematics. Once your counterparties know you are in trouble, the market stops being an abstraction and becomes a group of people who can see you. The dealers financing the fund knew its positions because they had financed them. They could work out what it would have to sell. So the spreads moved further against it. Not in the main from conspiracy, simply from a large number of firms independently deciding to reduce their own exposure to the same trades and to avoid being the last buyer of something a forced seller was about to dump. Meanwhile, the mechanics ground on. Every day, positions were marked to market. Every adverse mark produced a margin call. Every margin call had to be met in cash. And meeting it meant selling something into a market that had already worked out you were selling. This is where size stops being an advantage and becomes the central problem. The models valued the portfolio at market prices. But a market price is the price of the next small trade, not the price of your entire position. If you own a large fraction of the outstanding supply of an instrument, there is no price at which you can exit quickly. The exit price is whatever a distressed buyer chooses to offer, and the difference between that and the model price is not a modeling error. It is the cost of being big. By the middle of September, the fund's capital had fallen from about $4.7 billion at the start of the year to a few hundred million, while it still had something like $100 billion of assets on its books. At that ratio, the arithmetic ceases to mean anything. A 1% move against it wiped out everything remaining several times over. The partners went looking for capital. Merriweather approached, among others, Warren Buffett, George Soros, and a series of banks. In late September, a consortium of Berkshire Hathaway, Goldman Sachs, and the insurer AIG made a formal offer. Roughly $250 million for the portfolio itself, plus around $3.75 billion of new capital to run it. The offer would have wiped out the existing partners almost entirely, which was the point of it. It lapsed within hours, over a genuine legal question about whether Merriweather had authority to sell the fund's assets out from under his partners in that form. And at that moment, the problem stopped being a private one, because of what the Federal Reserve Bank of New York had just learned. The New York Fed had sent people, including its head of markets Peter Fisher, out to Greenwich to look at the fund's books. What they found was not simply a large fund in difficulty. It was a fund that sat at the center of a web of contracts with every significant dealer in the world. The exposure was not primarily lending. It was derivatives, thousands of swap and option contracts, each with a counterparty on the other side, each of them assuming that when the contract came due, the other party would perform. If the fund defaulted, those contracts would terminate simultaneously. Every counterparty would seize the collateral it held and sell it, all at once, into markets that were already in a flight to quality. Each firm would be acting entirely rationally, and collectively, they would be dumping tens of billions of dollars of the same positions into a market with no buyers. Worse, no individual bank could see the whole picture. Each knew its own exposure and had no idea how much of the same risk its competitors held, which meant that in a default nobody would know who else was hurt, and the sensible response to not knowing is to stop dealing with everybody. That is systemic risk stated precisely. The danger was never that a hedge fund would lose money. It was that the liquidation of a hedge fund would be conducted by 100 frightened firms at the same time. So on the 23rd of September 1998, William McDonough, the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, convened the principals of the major banks and securities firms at the Fed's building on Liberty Street. The proposition put to them was blunt. Either they collectively recapitalized the fund and wound it down in an orderly fashion over months, or they each took their chances in a disorderly liquidation, whose costs none of them could estimate. 14 firms agreed. They put in about $3.625 billion in exchange for 90% of the fund, and installed their own oversight committee to run the wind down. The existing partners were left with a residual stake and no control. One firm refused. Bear Stearns, which was the fund's clearing broker and therefore knew the positions better than anyone, declined to contribute. The decision was remembered by the other firms in the room, and it will come back at the end of this story. The Federal Reserve did not lend a dollar to long-term capital management. Its contribution was the room, the convening authority, and the implied message that the alternative was worse for everyone present. That distinction matters enormously to the argument about what happened next. Separately, the Fed cut interest rates 3 times that autumn, in late September, in the middle of October, and again in November. Whatever the official reasoning, it worked. Markets calmed, the flight to quality reversed, and spreads began slowly to converge. Which is the most uncomfortable fact in the whole affair: the trades were right. Over the following year, the portfolio was wound down profitably enough that the consortium recovered its investment with a small return by 2000. If the fund had been able to hold its positions for another 12 months, it would have made money on most of them. It could not hold them for another 12 months because holding a position requires funding it every single day, and the market decides whether you get to. The investors who had been in from the start lost the overwhelming majority of what they had. The partners lost most of their personal fortunes, having kept their own capital in the fund, and in several cases borrowed to invest more of it. That is worth noting against the standard telling. This was not a case of managers walking away rich. One thing before we go on: if you subscribe, it genuinely helps this channel keep going, and there is a new piece of American financial history every single day. And leave a comment while you are here. It matters more than you would think. Meriwether started another fund in 1999 and ran it for a decade before closing it in the crisis of 2008. Scholes and Merton returned to academic and advisory work. Mullins did not return to public office. So what should be taken from it? There are 5 lessons, and only the first one is usually stated. The first is the one everybody knows. Leverage magnifies. 25-to-1 means a 4% adverse move destroys you. Everyone involved knew this perfectly well, and it is the least interesting lesson available. The second is the important one. Diversification is not a property of a list of positions. It is an assumption about how those positions behave together under stress, and that behavior is determined by who owns them and how they are financed. The fund held hundreds of trades in a dozen markets on 3 continents. On paper, that is a diversified book. In reality, every one of those trades was financed the same way, held by the same kind of leveraged investor, and would be sold under the same conditions. It was one position wearing many hats. The general form of that lesson is that correlation is endogenous. Assets are not related or unrelated in themselves. They become related when the same balance sheets own them, and the more crowded a strategy becomes, the more tightly its components move together in precisely the conditions where you need them not to. The third lesson is about the difference between a price and an exit. A risk model treats the market price as the value of a position. That is true for a small holder and false for a large one, and there is no clean way to write the difference into a model, so it usually is not written in at all. If your position takes 3 months to liquidate in normal conditions, then in a crisis your true holding period is 3 months whether you like it or not. Liquidity is not a market characteristic. It is a relationship between the size of your position and the market's capacity to absorb it, and it evaporates exactly when it is needed. The fourth lesson concerns what history can tell you. The models were calibrated on years of price data, and the data were real. The problem is that the sample contained no example of the event that actually occurred, and a statistical model has no way of knowing what is missing from its inputs. Rare events are not rare in the way the arithmetic implies, because financial markets are not a natural process generating independent draws. They are a system of people who copy each other, which produces long placid stretches and sudden violent breaks, and a model fitted to the placid stretch will always understate the break. The fifth lesson is about the lenders, and it is the one the industry has had most difficulty with. The banks that financed the fund did not have to lend at almost no haircut. They chose to, because they were competing for the business of the most prestigious client in the market. That competition removed exactly the protection that would have limited the damage to the lenders, to the fund, and to everybody else. Every one of those banks then sat in a room at the Federal Reserve, discovering that their competitors' credit decisions had become their problem. Which brings us to the argument that has run ever since, and it is worth taking seriously on both sides. The case for what the Fed did is that it spent no public money, took no risk onto its balance sheet, and prevented a disorderly liquidation whose cost would have fallen on people with no connection to the fund. It was, on this reading, a fire warden clearing a building. The case against is that it established something. It demonstrated that a sufficiently interconnected private institution, not a bank, not regulated as one, not insured, could reach a point at which the central bank would organize its rescue. Once that is known, it changes behavior. It makes size and interconnection valuable in themselves because they buy a seat at that table. And the people who lend to such institutions will price their loans accordingly, which means the market's own discipline is weakened precisely where it is needed most. There is no clean answer to that argument, and anybody who offers one is selling something. What can be said is that the mechanism was documented at the time in public by the people responsible. In April 1999, the President's Working Group on Financial Markets, the Treasury, the Fed, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission published a report titled Hedge Funds, Leverage, and the Lessons of Long-Term Capital Management. Its central conclusion was that the problem was not hedge funds as such. It was excessive leverage extended by regulated institutions to unregulated ones, without adequate information about the total position, and it recommended better disclosure, improved counterparty risk management, and closer attention to concentration. Read that sentence again, and then consider what happened over the following decade. Regulated institutions extending very large amounts of leverage against instruments whose liquidity was assumed rather than tested, with no participant able to see the aggregate position. The report identified the mechanism of the 2008 crisis 9 years early and named it accurately. What it did not do, what a report cannot do, was change the incentives that produced it. And here is the detail that makes the point better than any argument. Bear Stearns was the one firm that refused to contribute to the rescue in 1998 on the reasonable ground that it was not its problem. In March 2008, Bear Stearns found itself unable to fund its own positions, highly leveraged, in instruments that had become impossible to sell at model prices, with counterparties withdrawing overnight. It was sold to J.P. Morgan in a weekend, in a transaction arranged by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, with public support this time. The mechanism that destroyed it was the same mechanism, exactly. A portfolio that was fine as long as it could be financed, and a market that stopped financing it. Nor did it end there. In March 2020, as the pandemic hit, hedge funds were again running a large leveraged position in the American Treasury market. The basis trade, buying cash bonds against short futures, financed in the repo market at very high leverage. When the flight to cash came, that trade was unwound at speed, and the market in United States Treasury securities, the deepest market on Earth, briefly stopped functioning properly. The Federal Reserve bought hundreds of billions of dollars of treasuries in a matter of weeks to restore it. The trade was, once again, a convergence trade between two nearly identical instruments, held in enormous size, financed daily, and correct in the long run. Which is the note to end on, and it is not really about hedge funds at all. Long-term capital management was not destroyed by being wrong. It was destroyed by the gap between being right and being able to wait. Everything in its portfolio depended on the willingness of other people to keep lending against it every morning, and that willingness is not a fact about the assets. It is a fact about the mood of the lenders. Any position financed with borrowed money contains a hidden second bet, that you will still be able to borrow tomorrow. That bet is invisible on the balance sheet. It does not appear in the risk model, and it is the one that decides whether you survive. It is also why the people who survive these episodes are so often the ones with the least impressive returns in the good years. Funding stability is expensive. Holding more cash than you need, borrowing less than you are offered, and running a position you could actually exit all cost performance in every quarter except the one that matters. And the cost is visible every quarter, while the benefit is invisible forever, because it takes the form of a disaster that did not occur and therefore never appears in any report. Nobody has ever been praised for the crisis they did not have, which is the underlying reason this keeps happening, and why the lesson has to be relearned by a new set of extremely intelligent people roughly once a decade. Which is why the useful question to ask of any strategy is not how likely it is to be right, It is a much duller question, and it is this. If this position moves against you for 90 days, who has to agree for you to still be holding it, and what would make them say no? Sources for this account include the April 1999 report of the President's Working Group on Financial Markets, Hedge Funds, Leverage, and the Lessons of Long-Term Capital Management, the testimony of Federal Reserve officials before the House Committee on Banking and Financial Services in October 1998, the General Accounting Office's review of the episode, contemporary financial press reporting of the September 1998 recapitalization, and the published accounts of the fund's strategies by its principals and by subsequent researchers.